Gold tycoon in America in 1850. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 401 The Advantages in Me. Pontianak was not defended for even a day. Batavia Governor Tevez was stunned by the news and could not speak for a long time. He knew what the loss of Pontianak meant. The defeat in the naval battle was a great blow to the Dutch-Indonesian authorities, but it was not fatal. As long as they were given a little time, Tevez could still organize and mobilize a relatively considerable naval force to fight Umbrella again. The loss of Pontianak meant that they lost the initiative in West Borneo Island, and the painstakingly managed South Borneo region would also be threatened. As for the Lamphang Company's armed forces in Donwanlu, they were obviously unreliable. Once the Dutch-Indonesian authorities withdrew from West Borneo, they could not provide armed support to the Lamphang Company. It was hard to say whether the Lamphang Company's armed forces could withstand the armed forces of the local Chinese Resistance Company, let alone resist the offensive of Liang Zhao's armed forces. Tevez, the Batavia governor, would not be unaware of the nature of the Royal Dutch-Indonesian Army. The biggest problem of the Royal Dutch Indochina Army was that the number of white soldiers, especially the native Dutch soldiers, was too small. They had to rely on local indigenous soldiers, especially the relatively loyal Java soldiers, to maintain their colonial rule in the East Indies. Such an army would naturally have no problem fighting against local indigenous people and disunited Chinese. Of course, the upper limit of the mob is to fight a favorable battle. If you encounter a tough battle, you can't count on it. Governor Tevez quickly sorted out his thoughts. On the one hand, he asked Cruzan to let the crew members who returned from the war rest, and on the other hand, he continued to mobilize and requisition the sea forces that the Dutch Indochina authorities could control, preparing to fight Liang Zhao again. After doing this, Tevez ordered Anderson of Kendoangan to defend Kendoangan and wait for reinforcements to arrive before counterattacking Pontianak. After Pontianak changed hands, Kendoangan became the only large colonial stronghold left by the Dutch Indochina authorities in West Borneo. Kendoangan must not make any more mistakes. If Kendoangan is lost again, there is no room for maneuver in the war in West Borneo, and the end waiting for Tevez will be resignation. Kendoangan is not far from Batavia. After a day and a half, General Anderson of the Royal Dutch and Indochina Army received Tevez's order. But Anderson did not seem to be prepared to obey Tevez's order. After learning that it was not a regiment of soldiers who captured the Pontianak fort, but a small number of armed forces composed of dozens of crew members and more than 100 Chinese resistance companies, Anderson felt greatly humiliated. Rather than saying that Pontianak was lost, it is better to say that they were scared away by 100 or 200 local infiltrators. This made Anderson, who had won consecutive victories in the East Indies and was invincible, lose face and was very unconvinced. If he lost to the white commanders of Britain and France, Anderson could still accept it. But losing to yellow-skinned and hairy boy was something Anderson could not tolerate. Only by retaking Pontianak can Anderson wash away his shame and make meritorious contributions. Otherwise, he would become a laughingstock among his colleagues. And from a famous general in the East Indies, he would become a laughingstock in the East Indies. We are soldiers, and soldiers should obey the orders of our superiors. Governor Tevez must have a reason for asking us to hold on and wait for help. Your Excellency, we should not take risks to attack. Liang Zhao's armed forces should not be underestimated. Waiting for reinforcements to arrive and counterattacking Pontianak with the cooperation of the Navy is a safer choice. Anderson's men opposed the counterattack on Pontianak at this time. Admittedly, part of the reason why Anderson's men opposed the counterattack on Pontianak now was because they were afraid of fighting and were not sure of defeating Liang Zhao's armed forces. But from the overall situation, it was indeed a safer approach to hold on and wait for help in Kendoangan with mature fortifications. And they did not want to disobey the orders of the governor of Batavia. You bunch of cowards. Do you want to retire in shame and return to your hometown? You must know your shame. You must know your shame. Anderson severely reprimanded these opinions and his subordinates who were leaning to the left. At the same time, he also explained that his decision to send troops to counterattack Pontianak at this time was based on rational analysis, rather than a decision made by emotional feelings. Liang Zhao has just occupied Pontianak and has not yet established a firm foothold. We have been operating in West Borneo for many years, and the local natives are loyal to us. The Lamfang Company of Dongwon lawyers is still resisting. These situations are very favorable for us to send troops to retake Pontianak. More importantly, Liang Zhao has few troops and is not greedy for merit and reckless. He chose to divide his troops into 3 routes, one to attack Dongwon La in the north, one to defend the coast, and only a small number of troops to guard Pontianak City. Pontianak City is now at its weakest defense, and now is the perfect time to retake Pontianak. If we wait until Liang Zhao builds fortifications in Pontianak, we will have to pay a greater price if we want to retake Pontianak. The opportunity is fleeting. Everyone, get ready, and follow me to the battle. After a fierce analysis, Anderson believed that the advantage was in my hands, and now was the best time to counterattack. He insisted on sending troops north to retake Pontianak, not giving his men any chance to refute. After Liang Zhao took Pontianak, the third governor of Hong Kong Island, Wen Xian, also became very interested in Liang Zhao. Wangsun watched the entire naval battle in the Java Sea. There are not many examples of naval battles in East Asia and Southeast Asia that can be called naval battles. In Wangsun's view, those so-called naval battles in the past were just small-scale naval military operations to eliminate pirates, and they could not be called real naval battles. But Wangsun believed that the evenly matched naval battle that broke out in the Java Sea near Pontianak was a real naval battle. At first, Wangsun was not optimistic that Liang Zhao could make a difference in Borneo Island. Although the Netherlands had declined, a lean camel was bigger than a horse. Wangsun believed before the war that Liang Zhao could not get any advantage from the Dutch Indies authorities. But what happened next quickly slapped Wangsun in the face. If Wangsun expected that the Java Sea naval battle ended with the Dutch East Indies withdrawing from the battlefield first, then taking Pontianak in less than a day was completely beyond Wangsun's expectations. Liang Zhao's military strength was stronger than he expected. Wangsun then decided to contact Liang Zhao first. Wangsun didn't care who would win in the final battle between Liang Zhao and the Dutch Indonesian authorities for hegemony over Borneo. What he cared most about was whether Britain's interests in Borneo would be damaged by the change of hegemony over Borneo. Wangsun wanted to know Liang Zhao's attitude towards the interests of the British Empire in Borneo. Your Excellency the Governor, you are a rare guest. Liang Zhao met Wangsun in Pontianak. As a native of Xiangshan, even though Wangsun had an amiable face and looked very gentlemanly in his behavior. But it was really hard for him to have a good impression of the so-called Governor of Hong Kong and Governor of Macau. But the headache was that he had to meet Wangsun. Liang Zhao still had a good chance of winning the battle for hegemony over Borneo with the Dutch Indonesian authorities. If the British troublemaker came in to disrupt the situation, it would really change the balance of victory and defeat between the two sides. In the Victorian era, Britain's maritime power was really invincible on the earth. Even if Liang Zhao hated a British troublemaker, he still had to find a way to stabilize the British first. Liang Zhao didn't expect the British to stand on his side, but he at least wanted the British to remain neutral on this matter. Chapter 402 Governor of Hong Kong. Governor, it's a pleasure to meet you. Liang Zhao met Governor Bonham in Pontianak. Bonham was born into a prominent family in Kentshire, England. His family made their fortune by selling slaves in their early years. But Bonham's decent manners, meticulous attire, and the style of an English aristocrat make it difficult to associate him with the image of a hard-working trader. This is also a true portrayal of many British aristocrats, who look glamorous and polite on the surface. But their ancestors, including even themselves, made their fortunes by running shady businesses, and few of their first pots of gold were clean. Bonham served as a scribe for the British East India Company in Sumatra in his early years, and then served in Singapore. He also served briefly as the governor of the Straits, in charge of the colonial affairs of Malacca and Singapore. Bonham's rich work experience in Southeast Asia made him familiar with the specific conditions of Southeast Asian countries and even his competitor, the Dutch East India Company. Heroes have always emerged from youth. I am very lucky to meet the youngest general in the United States, Wen Xian said with a smile. Liang Zhao would not be too surprised if Wen Xian spoke to him in Chinese. After all, there are many China experts in the UK, and many senior executives of the British East India Company can speak Chinese. But Wen Xian spoke fluent Cantonese, which was not awkward to listen to, which surprised Liang Zhao. Wen Xian's smile was very kind, giving people a kind feeling. Liang Zhao knew that this was just an illusion. During his tenure as governor of Hong Kong, Wen Xian also served as Minister Plenipotentiary to China and Director of Commerce in China. And he did these jobs better than his predecessors. Such a person is definitely not an easy character to deal with. Your Excellency the Governor, please sit down. I think Your Excellency the Governor has come all the way to Pontianak, not to talk to me about these things. Liang Zhao also smiled and asked Wen Xian to sit down, and ordered someone to serve tea to Wen Xian. I am deeply surprised by the sudden dispatch of troops to Borneo by the American authorities. I wonder why you have provoked a dispute with the Netherlands without any reason, Wen Xian said intentionally or unintentionally. After speaking, Wen Xian paid attention to Liang Zhao's reaction. Why did the British Empire declare war on the Qin dynasty without any reason or sign? Liang Zhao asked calmly. Of course, it is to protect the safety of the people of the British Empire in China and defend the right of the British Empire to free trade, Wen Xian answered without hesitation. In this case, our purpose is the same as that of the British Empire. This time we sent troops to Borneo to protect the safety of American citizens doing business in Borneo and their right to free trade. The Dutch authorities have massacred our American expatriates more than once or twice. We have warned them several times, but they still turned a deaf ear. I think if your government encountered such a situation, it would not stand idly by, Liang Zhao said after taking a sip of tea. As far as I know, there are no American expatriates in West Borneo, Wen Xian said with a frown. The reason Liang Zhao gave seemed a little weak to Wen Xian. Liang Zhao was not in a hurry. He looked Wen Xian in the eye and asked him back. Your Excellency, do you think I look more like an expatriate of the Qin dynasty or an expatriate of the United States? Wen Xian was speechless for a moment. On the surface, Liang Zhao was naturally more like an expatriate of the Qin dynasty, but it was only on the surface. Wen Xian suddenly realized that now America not only has Yankees and Dixies, but also Chinese immigrants in the West Coast region, which is already a force that cannot be underestimated. Of course the generals of the United States are Americans, ha ha ha, Wen Xian laughed to dispel the awkward atmosphere. Your Excellency, I think the reason why we sent troops to Borneo is not what you are most concerned about. After practicing Tai Chi with the Wen Xian for a while and exchanging a few polite words, Liang Zhao got to the topic of this conversation. Compared to these insignificant issues, I think you should be more concerned about the issue of the Brooke dynasty in Sarawak. The Brooke dynasty in Sarawak, a dynasty established by the British, is a protectorate of the British Empire. It is also the starting point of the British colonization of North Borneo and the core interest of the British Empire in Borneo. The Brooke dynasty is not so much a dynasty as a colonial outpost of the British Empire in North Borneo. What do you think of the Brooke dynasty? Wangson was somewhat looking forward to Liang Zhao's attitude towards the Brooke dynasty. As long as your country supports us in defending and protecting the rights of overseas Chinese and protecting free trade, we also support your country's legal rule over the Sarawak region, and conduct trade and jointly develop these barren lands, as he said. Liang Zhao asked Deng Wencan to fetch a map, took out the pen in his chest pocket, and after thinking for a while, he drew a circle in the Sarawak region on the map that was slightly larger than the actual control area of the Brooke dynasty. Wangson was not very opposed to the demarcation drawn by Liang Zhao, nor was he very satisfied. Wen Xian shook his head, then pointed to the Sultanate of Brunei on the map and said, West Borneo belongs to you, North Borneo belongs to the Brooke dynasty, and we will no longer ask about the ownership of South Borneo and East Borneo. Wen Xian hoped to bring the entire North Borneo region under the rule of the British Empire. The ownership of North Borneo has touched Liang Zhao's core interests. This time, the California high-level officials are willing to organize armed forces to follow Liang Zhao to the Borneo expedition. The most important reason is for the oil in North Borneo. If the British take Borneo, Liang Zhao will not be able to explain to the California high-level officials. On the issue of whose sphere of influence North Borneo belongs to, Liang Zhao will never give in. Your country has obtained tens of thousands of square kilometers of land without sending a single soldier. I think you can also explain to Her Majesty the Queen. If the representatives of the Dutch Indonesian authorities are negotiating with you now, I think Batavia will never give such generous conditions. What they want is the entire Borneo island, Liang Zhao said very seriously. Besides, the Brunei Sultanate is still in existence, and its strength is the best among all the chiefdoms. I heard that the Brooke dynasty did not gain much advantage in the war with the Brunei Sultanate. It is too early to discuss the ownership of North Borneo now. Britain is now deeply mired in the Crimean War, and the Far East and Southeast Asian issues are not the focus of Britain's attention. The reason why Liang Zhao chose to send troops to Borneo at this time is that Britain and France are deeply mired in the Crimean War and cannot spare their hands to interfere too much in the affairs of East Asia and Southeast Asia. What do you mean? When Xian asked, staring at the map. The sphere of influence demarcated by Liang Zhao can indeed make Wen Xian have a satisfactory explanation to London, but he and London want more territory. No country will think that its territory and colonies are small. First come, first served, Liang Zhao also said, staring at the North Borneo region on the map. Wen Xian didn't know what Liang Zhao was up to, but he was very satisfied with this answer. Liang Zhao was now going to fight the Dutch Indochina authorities. Wang Xun did not believe that Liang Zhao could send troops to conquer the Brunei Sultanate when his troops were stretched to the limit. Liang Zhao's idea coincided with Wang Xun's. Liang Zhao also believed that Britain was unable to send troops to conquer North Borneo at this time. Britain had countless colonies around the world, which could be an advantage, but at some point, it could also be a disadvantage. Chapter 403 Dongwanlu. Dongwanlu area. The armed forces of the Lanfang Company were defeated by the fierce offensive of Elvis and the rearmed Chinese Resistance Company. In order to avoid being wiped out, the armed forces of the Lanfang Company, which besieged Luai, Montreto, the headquarters of the Sanjiao Gao Company, hurriedly evacuated Luai. The situation in Luai soon turned from danger to safety. Not only Luai, but also the settlements of Wana, Xinguang, Baguding, Xinputao, etc., which were originally under the control of the Lanfang Company, changed hands within half a month. The coalition forces of Elvis and the Chinese Resistance Company swept across the entire West Borneo region in an instant like autumn wind sweeping fallen leaves. The armed forces of the Lanfang Company, dressed in green camp officers, were as vulnerable as the green camp soldiers. Most of the soldiers of the Lanfang Company were miners, who were deeply dissatisfied with Liu Shaoxun's betrayal of the company's rights and interests and his willingness to be the traitors of the Dutch. Except for a small number of Liu Shaoxun's father-in-law and son-in-law's personal soldiers, no one was willing to follow Liu Shaoxun all the way to the end. Previously, they were willing to work for Liu Shaoxun, but their wives and children were under the control of the company, so they had no choice. Seeing that it was only a matter of time before Liu Shaoxun was destroyed, the Lanfang Company soon collapsed. Wherever the coalition forces passed, the Chinese residents of each settlement welcomed the arrival of the coalition forces with food and drink. Elvis was deeply influenced by Liang Zhao's teachings and was very strict in managing the army. The coalition forces were also well supplied, so there was no conflict with the residents of the Guangfu settlements, and the relationship between the two sides was very harmonious. Liu Shanbang arrested the senior executives of the Lanfang Company and prepared to execute them on the spot. Elvis stepped forward to stop Liu Shanbang's behavior. Colonel Elvis. These people are traitors. They deserve to die. Thinking of what the Lanfang Company's management did on a daily basis, Liu Shanbang was furious. If you knew what they did on weekdays, you would think that they deserved their retribution today. Of course, I don't deny that. Elvis glanced at the embarrassed Lanfang Company management. They really deserve it the most. They must be properly tried to get justice, but not now. Wana, Xinguang, Baguding, Xinputao and other settlements have just been recovered, and the people in these newly recovered places are unstable. Elvis thinks it is unwise to launch a large-scale purge and try these traitors now. He is just a soldier, not a politician or judge. Elvis is not sure whether the liquidation of these traitors will be expanded to affect ordinary people. Elvis doesn't like to do things he is not good at. What's more, Dongwanlu, the headquarters of the Lanfang Company, is still under the control of Liu's father-in-law and son-in-law. If Dongwanlu is not taken, his mission will not be completed. Dongwanlu has been operated by several generations of Lanfang Company for 70 or 80 years, and its defense facilities are relatively complete. If it is attacked by force, its own losses will definitely not be small. These Lanfang Company management are also useless to Elvis. Attacking the city and the heart is the best. If Dongwanlu can be conquered without a fight and a complete Dongwanlu is handed over to Liang Zhao, it will undoubtedly be a perfect ending. After persuading Liu Shanbang, Elvis turned around and said to the management of Lanfang Company in a deep voice, I know you have committed many crimes, but now, I am willing to give you a chance to redeem yourself, Dongwanlu at this time. Although the coalition forces have not yet approached Dongwanlu, Everyone with a discerning eye knows that it is only a matter of time before the coalition forces attack Dongwanlu. The whole city of Dongwanlu is in a panic. In the main hall of Lanfang Company, the general manager Liu Shaoxin, with his braids loose, was smoking on the couch with a kerosene lamp. Next to him were the management of Lanfang Company who were also smoking like him, making the main hall of Lanfang Company a mess. Liu Shaoxin's son-in-law, Yi Tingfen, packed up his gold and silver jewelry and came to the main hall with his wife. He snatched the pipe from Liu Shaoxin's hand and said, "Dad, don't smoke anymore. It's not too late to smoke when we get to Batavia. I have asked people to prepare a boat in Sarawak. Let's get on the boat from Sarawak and take a boat to Batavia." Batavia? Ho-ha ho-ha? After the choking smoke, the expression on Liu Shaoxin's face was not sure whether he was crying or laughing. Through this thick layer of smoke, Yi Tingfen could only hear Liu Shaoxin's self-deprecating and playful laughter. "Why are you laughing, Dad?" Yi Tingfen asked, puzzled. "My good son-in-law, Dad is laughing at you for being stupid." Liu Shaoxin laughed wildly, snatched the pipe from Yi Tingfen's hand and continued to smoke. "If we don't go to Batavia, can we go back to Guangdong? Liang Zhao has a close personal relationship with the governor of Guangdong, the governor-general of Guangdong and Guangxi, and even the admiral of the navy. Going back to Guangdong is a dead end," Yi Tingfen said. At this point, Dongwanlu is definitely not going to be able to defend. Staying in Dongwanlu is a dead end. Yi Tingfen doesn't want to stay in Dongwanlu and wait for death. He wants to continue living. Yi Tingfen is carrying the blood debt of the Chinese Resistance Company, and the Chinese Resistance Company will definitely not forgive him. Which of the leaders of the Resistance Company, Wang Jia, Liu Shanbang, etc., does not want to tear him into pieces? Dongwanlu cannot be defended, and he cannot return to his hometown in Guangdong. The only way left for him to survive is Batavia. He still has some value to the Dutch now, and only Liang Zhao's mortal enemy, the Dutch, can provide him with protection. Yi Tingfen believes that as long as he arrives in Batavia, he will be safe. No matter how powerful Liang Zhao is, can he still go to Batavia to capture him? Liu Shaoxin disagrees. Liu Shaoxin believes that Batavia is not safe. After the Dutch-Chinese War, the two sides will have to negotiate. If the Dutch win in the end, it will be fine. As the victorious party, the lives of the senior executives of the Lanfang Company will naturally be safe. But if the Dutch were defeated, the senior executives of the Lanfang Company would also be put on the negotiation table as bargaining chips for both sides. At that time, not to mention in Batavia, even in Amsterdam, once Liang Zhao and the Dutch reached an agreement, the Dutch would hand them over to Liang Zhao. The value of the father-in-law and son-in-law to the Dutch lies in their control of the Lanfang Company, which can maintain the rule of the Dutch in West Borneo where the forces are intertwined. Once the Lanfang Company is destroyed, they will no longer be the helmsmen of the Lanfang Company, and they will naturally have no use value to the Dutch. The Dutch may not accept them. Liu Shaoxin, who has been struggling in Borneo for decades, knows this very well. But Liu Shaoxin does not intend to tell Yi Tingfen about this. Liu Shaoxin needs Yi Tingfen to attract the attention of the Chinese Resistance Company and Liang Zhao for him. Liu Shaoxin sat cross-legged on the couch, holding a pipe in his hand, and said to Yi Tingfen with a solemn expression, "You're just going to go there without any evidence? Will the Dutch accept you? What does Dad mean?" Yi Tingfen didn't understand what he meant. Chapter 404, The Army Approaches. Your identity must be valuable to the Dutch, so they won't neglect you. Foreigners are always snobbish. If you are useful to them, they will look up to you. If you are useless to them, they will discard you like a worn-out shoe, Liu Shaoxin said leisurely. What does Dad mean? Yi Tingfen asked. The reason why the Dutch rely on us father and son is that we father and son control the Lanfang Company. As long as you become the general manager of the Lanfang Company, you will be valuable to the Dutch, and you will be able to become a bargaining chip that the Dutch are reluctant to lose, Liu Shaoxin said with narrowed eyes. The general manager of the company is you, Dad. I dare not have such an intention. The position of general manager must be recommended by all the respected elders to be effective. How can it be so childish? Yi Tingfen swallowed his saliva and refused. It is impossible to say that he has no idea about the general manager of the Lanfang Company. It's just that Yi Tingfen relies on becoming Liu Shaoxin's son-in-law and holding on to Liu Shaoxin's thigh to get his current position in the Lanfang Company. Without Liu Shaoxin, Yi Tingfen would be nothing. He could only maintain his current position by obeying Liu Shaoxin. Yu Tingfen didn't know whether Liu Shaoxin really wanted him to be the general manager of Lanfang Company or was testing his loyalty, so Yu Tingfen answered very cautiously. In an emergency, we must act according to the expedients. In an extraordinary period, we must do extraordinary things. Liu Shaoxin got off the couch and asked someone to bring the seal of the general manager of Lanfang Company. He told Yu Tingfen earnestly. When we get to Batavia, take good care of my daughter. Yu Tingfen's hand was shaking as he took the seal. Yu Tingfen asked with a choked voice. What about you, Dad? Liu Shaoxin looked righteous and said with certainty, Dad is the general manager of the company and should live and die with the company. Dad is righteous. Yu Tingfen kowtowed to Liu Shaoxin solemnly several times, and then said goodbye to Liu Shaoxin in tears. While Dong Wanlu was still surrounded by the coalition forces, Yu Tingfen secretly left Dong Wanlu by a small road and boarded a long-prepared ship to Batavia. Liu Shaoxin certainly would not choose to live and die with the Lanfang Company. Of course, the Lanfang Company might not die, at most it would be annexed by other Chinese companies, and once Liu Shaoxin fell into the hands of the coalition forces, he would be dead. Liu Shaoxin was very self-aware of this. However, Liu Shaoxin believed that it was not safe to go to Batavia. As long as the Dutch and Liang Zhao negotiated for peace, he would inevitably be exchanged to Liang Zhao as a bargaining chip for the peace talks. In the end, his life and death would still be decided by Liang Zhao. In order to appease the Chinese people's emotions against the company, Liang Zhao would inevitably execute him. It was also unrealistic to return to Guangdong. What Yu Tingfen could think of, Liu Shaoxin could not have thought of. Liu Shaoxin had already thought of a way out for himself, but his way out was Hong Kong instead of Batavia. As long as he was in the British territory, Liang Zhao would not dare to do anything to him even if he had 3 heads and 6 arms. Moreover, the British had also coveted Borneo for a long time, and he was also valuable to the British. Liu Shaoxin believed that the British did not want the Dutch to occupy the entire island of Borneo, and naturally did not want Liang Zhao to occupy the entire island of Borneo. Moreover, going north to Hong Kong is much safer than going south to Batavia. It just so happened that Yu Tingfen could conceal his tracks, so it was okay to give the position of the general manager of the Lanfang Company to Yu Tingfen at this time. This position, which was once glorious, was now a hot potato. As soon as Yu Tingfen left, Liu Shaoxin had people spread the news in Dong Wanlu that he was terminally ill and that the position of the general manager of the company would be taken over by Yu Tingfen. He packed up the gold overnight, and took his confidants to escort himself and his children and grandchildren to Sarawak, and took a British merchant ship from Sarawak to Hong Kong. 3 days later, Elvis arrived at the gates of Dong Wanlu. The huge city of Dong Wanlu had long been in a state of being leaderless. At this time, the people in the city were uneasy. They also heard that the coalition's policy was lenient, and they did not abuse prisoners or kill innocent people. In addition, many miners were not in the same mind as the senior management of Lanfang Company, so how could they have any intention to fight? Elvis only sent people to persuade them to surrender, and Dong Wanlu City raised the white flag to surrender. The smoothness of the war in Dong Wanlu even exceeded Elvis's expectations before the war. However, when entering the city, the coalition forces were attacked sporadically by some diehards, who were actually Liu Shaoxin's personal soldiers. However, due to early preparations, these sporadic sneak attacks did not cause them much damage. Elvis led his troops to the headquarters of Lanfang Company, lowered the flag of Lanfang Company hanging in the headquarters, and replaced it with the umbrella flag of Umbrella Company. Dong Wanlu has been taken. In addition to sending people to Liang Zhao to report the victory, Elvis searched the management of Lanfang Company and Liu Shaoxin's personal soldiers in the city. These people must be liquidated. At the same time, although the war in Dong Wanlu had just ended, Pontianak was once again plunged into the shadow of war. Anderson's re-entry into Pontianak so quickly was beyond Liang Zhao's expectations. When he first learned the news, Liang Zhao even suspected that there was something wrong with his ears. Did he hear it wrong? But soon, the news was confirmed. Anderson led more than 4,500 soldiers of the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army, including 1,300 European soldiers, and the rest were local soldiers of various ethnic groups. They came in full force and vowed to recapture Pontianak. The enemy's momentum is very strong. Should we transfer some of the troops stationed on the coast to Pontianak City to strengthen the troops in Pontianak City? Deng Wenkang suggested. According to the information they have, 4,500 people are all the troops that the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army can mobilize on the island of Borneo. Liang Zhao even boldly judged that a considerable number of the soldiers might be the men that Anderson had just recruited. The combat effectiveness of such an army is definitely not that strong. At present, there is sufficient ammunition in Pontianak. With a current regular army of more than 1,000 people in Pontianak, it is more than enough to defend Pontianak. Liang Zhao is most worried about Anderson's land military force at this time. Liang Zhao is more worried about the Dutch's naval power. At present, most of Liang Zhao's battleships are not in good condition, and it will take some time for the naval forces mobilized from California to reach Pontianak. What Liang Zhao is most afraid of now is that the Dutch will use their superior naval forces to block Pontianak's maritime traffic. The outside materials cannot come in, and the people inside cannot go out. This is the most uncomfortable. After all, no matter how abundant the materials are, there will always be a day when they are exhausted. Pontianak's industrial base is almost zero, and it is impossible to produce any industrial products. The combat effectiveness of the Western Brigade is precisely based on sufficient material supply. Although the Java Sea battle was barely won, Liang Zhao did not get carried away. He knew very well that the Dutch Indonesian authorities still had naval power, and they only temporarily controlled part of the sea control. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 405, The Choice of the Chiefdom. The garrison on the coast cannot be transferred. The garrison on the coast guards the mouth of the Kapuas River. As long as the mouth of the Kapuas River is in our hands, the Dutch ships cannot come in and cannot threaten Pontianak. Liang Zhao refused to mobilize the garrison on the coast. As long as the mouth of the Kapuas River is in his hands, the garrison in Pontianak can echo the garrison on the coast, and it is not a dead end. Moreover, the garrison on the coast is also a threat to the Royal Dutch and Dutch army that surrounded Pontianak, as long as these garrisons are still on the coastal positions. Anderson had to divide his troops to guard against the garrison on the coast, which would invisibly tie down a part of Anderson's forces. General Liang is right. The mouth of the Kapuas River and Pontianak are interdependent, and neither place can be lost. The men in Pontianak have more or less served in the army. If they are properly organized, they can also be reorganized into a team, Yu Tenghu suggested. General Yi, I'll leave it to you to organize the men in the city. The Dutch still have some guns in their warehouses. We can organize a team of 1,000 people to help defend the city. Liang Zhao agreed to Yu Tenghu's proposal. Liang Zhao then asked Sven, have you found any Dutch ships in the nearby waters? Sven shook his head decisively. Not to mention the nearby waters, the Dutch ships in Batavia have not been seen heading towards Pontianak. This result surprised Liang Zhao. Without the cooperation of the Navy, this Anderson dared to send troops to recapture Pontianak? That's right. Our spies in Batavia have not seen any new moves by the Dutch fleet. Their main battleships have been seriously damaged. According to the news just received, these ships were still under repair in the dock when the news was sent, Yu Tenghu said. Intelligence from various sources showed that Anderson's military action seemed to be carried out without the support of the East Indies fleet. This seemed a bit incredible to Liang Zhao. Pontianak is a port city. It is a bit puzzling that the Dutch did not use their naval forces, which they are good at, to attack port cities, but only used the army. Did Anderson send troops privately without the permission of Batavia in order to avenge his previous shame? This thought flashed through Liang Zhao's mind. Only this explanation is reasonable, but doing so is really not in line with the image of a professional commander. Liang Zhao's eyes lingered on Kendaangan on the map. It was the last large colonial base of the Dutch Indonesian authorities in West Borneo. If Anderson came out in full force, wouldn't it mean that Kendaangan's current defense is very empty? Liang Zhao had a bold idea. Could he take advantage of the empty defense of Kendaangan and land on Kendaangan from the sea to catch Kendaangan off guard? Take down this colonial base of the Dutch Indonesian authorities? If Kendaangan is taken down, he will completely take the initiative in West Borneo. Even if the Dutch Indonesian authorities wanted to counterattack, they could only start from their strongholds in South Borneo, which would greatly reduce the efficiency of their deployment of troops, and Liang Zhao would have more time to react. Hasn't Elvis already taken over East Wanlu? Let Elvis rush back to Pontianak with his troops. I have other arrangements, Liang Zhao said. Anderson led an army of 500 people to Pontianak City and set up camp outside Pontianak City. At the same time, Anderson sent envoys to coerce Sultan Al-Qadri of the Sultanate of Pontianak to send troops to assist Anderson in attacking Pontianak City. At the same time, Anderson also asked Al-Qadri to provide food for his army. If he did not comply, the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army would first annihilate the Sultanate of Pontianak before attacking Pontianak City. It was the first time that Al-Qadri saw the Dutch mobilize so many troops at once, mobilizing 4,000 or 5,000 troops at a time, and the Dutch envoy's words were unprecedentedly harsh. Al-Qadri was caught in a dilemma. If he did not agree to the Dutch's request, the Sultanate of Pontianak would be wiped out. It's not that Al-Qadri hadn't thought about resisting the oppression of the Dutch, but the Dutch only sent out 200 or 300 people to beat them without temper. The Pontianak Sultanate really didn't have the capital to challenge the Dutch authorities. Liang Zhao allowed Anderson to dispatch so many troops to deal with him, so he was naturally not a good person. Al-Qadri was not sure who would be the final winner of this war, Liang Zhao or Anderson. Of course, he didn't dare to make a decision. Once he made a mistake, the Pontianak Sultanate would pay the price of national extinction. This is the sadness of the weak. Sometimes they don't even have room for choice and can only obey the power. Faced with Anderson's requests, Al-Qadri could only agree one by one. Reluctantly, he sent more than 1,000 soldiers from the tribe to fight for Anderson and provide food for Anderson's army. At the same time, Al-Qadri also sent an envoy to inform Liang Zhao of the matter, hoping to gain Liang Zhao's understanding. Al-Qadri did not expect that this move would gain the understanding of Liang Zhao and the Chinese, but at least he hoped that after the war, if the Chinese won, they would be treated more leniently. Liang Zhao soon learned the news. Anderson relied on the local Sultan chiefdom to provide supplies, which showed that Anderson was not well prepared, which also confirmed Liang Zhao's judgment. Anderson's dispatch of troops this time was probably his personal behavior, not the instruction of the Dutch Indonesian authorities. If Anderson's military action was carried out at the instruction of the Dutch Indonesian authorities, the Dutch Indonesian authorities would not have failed to provide Anderson with even the most basic logistical support. The Dutch Indonesian authorities may not care about the life and death of local soldiers, but they cannot care about the life and death of those European soldiers, especially the Dutch soldiers. These white soldiers are the foundation of the Dutch Indonesian authorities' rule over the East Indies. The Dutch manpower is not yet rich enough to provide more than 1,000 white soldiers for Anderson to take on military adventures. Respected General, our Sultan asked me to tell you that the Sultanate of Pontianak has no intention of helping the Dutch to deal with the Chinese. It is really a last resort. I hope you can be magnanimous and understand our Sultan's difficulties, the envoy of the Sultanate of Pontianak said. I am not a narrow-minded person, but I am not magnanimous enough to forgive the enemy. Go back and tell your Sultan that as long as he dares to help the Dutch fight and stand on the opposite side of me, I will regard him as an enemy. Liang Zhao said coldly. Send him away. If you want the Sultan of Pontianak to surrender, you can't do it without putting some pressure on them. Liang Zhao never thought of being a good guy. He certainly knew the situation of the Sultanate of Pontianak, but they had to choose a side, and stand on his side, otherwise there was no room for negotiation. The Sultanate of Sampha, north of Pontianak City, made a completely different choice from the Sultan of Pontianak at this time. Sultan Akhamuddin of the Sultanate of Sampha saw that the coalition forces of Liang Zhao and the Chinese Resistance Company quickly pacified the Lanfang Company with a crushing momentum. Akhamuddin made a choice quickly. After learning that the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army had surrounded Pontianak, he immediately sent an envoy to Pontianak to inform Liang Zhao that in this Dutch-Chinese war, the Sultanate of Sampha would stand firmly on the side of the Chinese. At the same time, he also assembled about 2,000 warriors from the tribe to go to Pontianak, ready to assist Liang Zhao in defending Pontianak to show his sincerity. Unlike the Sultanate of Pontianak, the Sultanate of Pontianak is the richest sultanate in West Borneo. It occupies the fertile land of West Borneo and has gold mines. The population of the tribe is more than 100,000 and the population is prosperous. The territories of the Sultanate of Sampha are all poor and barren, and its population is less than 80,000. The national strength is far behind that of the Sultanate of Pontianak. About 2,000 full-time soldiers are already the limit that Akhamuddin can mobilize. Chapter 406 Protection. We, the Sultanate of Sanfa, are willing to cooperate with you." Achaemudin personally led his army to Pontianak City to pay a visit to Liang Zhao to show his sincerity and cooperation. "It's not cooperation, it's protection." Liang Zhao looked at the Sultan, who was in his prime and quite aware of the times, and emphasized, he and the Chinese resistance company in West Borneo were not equal partners, not to mention these local chiefdoms. He risked his troops for the economic interests and strategic value of Borneo, not to be a good guy here. He wanted face, but also substance. Protection. Achaemudin was slightly stunned. "Yes, protection, but you still have the power of autonomy, and we will not interfere too much in your internal affairs," Liang Zhao said in an unquestionable tone. "Umbrella will provide security for the Sultanate of Sanfa, just as the British East India Company provided protection for the Brooke dynasty, as long as these chiefdoms are obedient and their interests in Borneo can be guaranteed. Liang Zhao will allow these chiefdoms to maintain autonomy." "So what do you need from us?" After a moment's silence, Achaemudin slowly asked. He knew that there was a price to pay for Liang Zhao's protection. He seemed to be in a heavy mood. Since Britain and the Netherlands set foot in Borneo, the life of the sultanates in Borneo has been getting worse day by day, especially for a small sultanate like Sanfa, which was already poor and weak, and its poor life was even worse. For Achaemudin, there was no essential difference between the three foreign forces of Britain, the Netherlands and China. If there was any difference, it was that Achaemudin was slightly less resistant to accepting the protection of the Chinese forces of the same skin color. "Assist us in the battle and help us maintain order on the island of Borneo. Of course, we will not let you be cannon fodder like the Dutch did," Liang Zhao said. Liang Zhao has enough regular troops, and currently only has Pontianak as an overseas territory. In a sense, Liang Zhao actually has a local advantage in military strength in West Borneo. Liang Zhao has his own considerations for not letting the soldiers of the Sanfa Sultanate be cannon fodder. Firstly, the Sultanate of Sanfa was the first local chiefdom to surrender to him. He needed a good example to promote and attract other chiefdoms whose attitudes were wavering. Secondly, these recruits who had not received formal military training would not be of much help to him, even if they went to the battlefield to fight the Dutch Indonesian army. They would only cause trouble. They were more suitable for some auxiliary work rather than fighting. "I came to Pontianak this time to assist you in the battle. But our Sultanate suffered a disaster this year and urgently needed some life-saving food," said Achaemudin. Liang Zhao looked at Ye Tanghu, the former general manager of the Lanfang Company, who was standing aside. Ye Tanghu nodded to Liang Zhao. Achaemudin did not lie to him. After the outbreak of the Dutch-Chinese War, the chiefdoms on the island were also forced to be involved in the Dutch-Chinese War, and normal production activities were also affected by the war. Therefore, lack of food and clothing was the norm in the entire West Borneo region. In order to maintain basic living, the Chinese resistance companies such as San Xiaogao even completely gave up mining activities and engaged in agricultural production activities, barely maintaining a state of not starving to death and continuing to fight with the Dutch Indonesian authorities. "As long as you obey our arrangements, I can provide you with some food first," Liang Zhao said. After taking over the warehouse of the Dutch Indonesian authorities in Pontianak, Liang Zhao still had a little surplus in his hands, including the food he transported from Xiangshan. "We will definitely obey your arrangements," Achaemudin said hurriedly. After the camp of the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army was set up, Anderson launched an attack on Pontianak. The tactics adopted by the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army were still the tactics of the line era. It was just on this basis that they were improved according to the characteristics of the colonial army. Their formation was basically that the native soldiers stood in front and the European soldiers stood in the back to reduce the casualties of European soldiers. Facing Anderson's offensive, Liang Zhao decided to show weakness to the enemy and continue to paralyze Anderson, so that Anderson would think that his ability to occupy Pontianak was entirely due to some accidental factors. Under the fierce offensive of the Dutch Indonesian Army, Liang Zhao took the initiative to abandon the first line of defense on the periphery. Most officers and soldiers of the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army were very happy to easily take down the first line of defense outside Pontianak. They thought that Liang Zhao's army was just like that and was not fundamentally different from other Chinese armies. The reason why they were able to take down Pontianak was just because they played some tricks. Of course, this was also Anderson's idea. Anderson was always upset about the change of hands of Pontianak. After all, since the Dutch-Chinese War, only the Netherlands occupied its Chinese settlements. The Chinese had no ability to seize settlements, especially large settlements, from the Dutch Indonesian army. However, there were still a few Dutch Indonesian army officers who felt that it was a bit abnormal. They always felt that it was a bit wrong to take down the first outer line of defense outside Pontianak so easily. These few Dutch Indonesian army officers suggested to postpone the offensive. They came lightly this time, and the artillery they carried were all small-caliber artillery. They lacked heavy weapons for attacking. But these few discordant voices were quickly drowned out. Many Dutch Indonesian army officers said that they wanted to recapture Pontianak in one fell swoop and win the first credit. Without exception, Anderson stood on the side of the officers who advocated pursuing the victory. But this time, Liang Zhao decided not to give up the second line of defense. Because Pontianak City only has 3 lines of defense, the second line of defense can still wrap the entire Pontianak City area and provide protection for the entire Pontianak City area. Once the second line of defense is abandoned, Liang Zhao will only have the last third line of defense, which is the wooden city wall of the core city area of Pontianak. It is called a city wall, but it is actually just a wooden fence. The bait can be put, but it cannot be too big. Liang Zhao will not risk losing part of the Pontianak City area to lure the Dutch Indonesian army to take the bait. Let the cavalry company prepare well and catch more guinea pigs later. Liang Zhao put away the telescope and explained to the officers around him. The Dutch Indonesian army arrived as scheduled. A colonel of the Dutch Indonesian army led an infantry regiment composed of more than 300 European soldiers and about 800 Java native soldiers to force 1,000 native soldiers of the Pontianak Sultanate to line up in a fairly neat queue and slowly advance towards Liang Zhao's second line of defense, that is, the second trench fortification. The artillery of the Dutch Indonesian army opened fire first. However, at this time, the soldiers of the Western Brigade had already huddled in the cat ear holes that had been dug to avoid a bombardment. The artillery of the Dutch Indonesian army fired solid bullets, and as long as the solid bullets did not roll on the flat ground, their killing ability to personnel was extremely limited. Therefore, although the artillery of the Dutch Indonesian army was fighting vigorously and with great momentum, the casualties caused to the Western Brigade were actually almost negligible. When the bombardment ended, the soldiers of the Western Brigade, under the command of the non-commissioned officers, got out of the cat ear holes, relied on the trenches, and waited for the Dutch Indonesian army to enter the firing range. After the Dutch Indonesian army entered the firing range of the Western Brigade, there was a sound of sub-zero, and thousands of metal projectiles were ejected from the trenches, hitting the line formation of the Dutch Indonesian army like raindrops. Chapter 407 The Wolf is Coming. The Pontianak Sultanate soldiers, who were standing at the front of the formation as human shields, were the first to face the baptism of gunfire and rain of bullets. After only 2 or 3 rounds of shooting, the Pontianak Sultanate soldiers collapsed and scattered. Even if the Java soldiers behind them, who were higher in status than them, fired at them and forced them to continue moving forward, it would be useless. Facing the massive attack of the Dutch Indonesian army, Liang Zhao's face was still very relaxed, and he did not regard the Dutch Indonesian army as a strong enemy at all. Governor Bonham, who was watching the battle on the side, also expressed his differences with Liang Zhao's calmness and the performance of the Western Brigade. Bonham was not born in the military, but he was not completely a layman in military affairs. He keenly noticed that the Western Brigade's shooting speed was very fast, even faster than the British Army that had just replaced the 1851 Minié rifle. Looking at the Dutch Indonesian army falling in groups like wheat harvested in autumn, the Pontianak Sultanate soldiers thought that the strange rifles equipped by the Western Brigade would not be low in accuracy. When Xian wondered if there would be a different result if he was in command of the Dutch Indonesian army. Unfortunately, his answer was not optimistic. Perhaps he would not underestimate the enemy like Anderson, but if he were to engage in a shootout with the Western Brigade, he would also be at a disadvantage. In the face of absolutely advanced technology, brilliant tactics and strategies could hardly make up for the technical disadvantages. Dresser needle-fired rifles. When Xian looked at the guns equipped by the guards and noticed that the guns equipped by these soldiers seemed to be the dresser needle-fired rifles equipped by the Prussian army. Yes, the California Infantry Regiment is equipped with dresser needle-fired rifles, Liang Zhao said lightly. He did not lie to Wen Xian. The California Infantry Regiment was indeed equipped with the dresser needle-fired rifles currently in service with the Prussian army. But it was only the California Infantry Regiment that was equipped with the Dresser needle-fired rifles currently in service with the Prussian Army. The rest of the infantry regiments, whether they were long guns or short guns, were equipped with firearms produced in California. As the Walter M1851 rifle matures, Liang Zhao is considering replacing the California Infantry Regiment with the Walter M1851 rifle to reduce logistical pressure. Moreover, these Dresser needle-fired rifles have another disadvantage, that is, they can only fire paper shell bullets, not metal ammunition. Liang Zhao cannot specially develop and open a production line to produce metal ammunition for the 3,000 Dresser needle-fired rifles on hand. The gun engineers in California have mastered the technology of Dresser needle-fired rifles. As a transitional light weapon purchased by Liang Zhao, the Dresser needle-fired rifle has completed its mission. As far as I know, the Prussian Army's Dresser needle-fired rifle is not for sale, Wen Xian said thoughtfully. As long as the price is high enough, nothing is not for sale, Liang Zhao said. As he spoke, the Dutch-Indonesian army was on the verge of collapse under the attack of the Western Brigade. After the Pontianak Sultanate soldiers who served as meat shields in the front were defeated, the Java native soldiers in the Dutch-Indonesian army had to act as meat shields in advance. This time, it was the turn of the Javanese soldiers to break up, and the European soldiers at the back acted as the supervisors. Obviously, this trick didn't work anymore. The Javanese soldiers knew that if they continued to charge forward, they would die, and if they ran away, they could still save their lives by chance, so they were unwilling to continue to be human shields for the white men. In a blink of an eye, only the European white soldiers were left in the line formation of the Dutch-Indonesian army. These white soldiers symbolically fired a volley of gunfire in the direction of the trenches and then retreated. At this time, the cavalry company attacked and pursued the remnants of the Dutch-Indonesian army to expand the results of the battle. Unfortunately, Liang Zhao only had one cavalry company, and the results achieved were relatively limited. In this battle, the Western Brigade killed and wounded 420 native soldiers of the Pontianak Sultanate, 260 Javanese soldiers of the Dutch-Indonesian Army, and 87 white soldiers of the Dutch-Indonesian Army. 340 native soldiers of the Pontianak Sultanate and Javanese soldiers, as well as 41 white soldiers of the Dutch-Indonesian Army were captured. Such casualties were not serious enough for the Dutch-Indonesian Army, but they were not small. Liang Zhao believed that after this lesson, Anderson would not organize too big an offensive unless heavy weapons and support troops were in place. Liang Zhao's current goal was to attract and delay Anderson's main force in Borneo, and wait for Elvis' army to return to Pontianak, so that Elvis could sneak attack Kindalangan by boat. Of course, the Sultanate of Pontianak could continue to exert pressure and inducement. As long as the Sultanate of Pontianak could be won over, it would be a big blow to the logistics of the Dutch-Indonesian army. After the defeat of the Dutch-Indonesian army, the Western Brigade took advantage of the situation and easily recovered the trenches that were abandoned as bait. After this defeat, Anderson also realized that his loss to Liang Zhao and the loss of Pontianak were not accidental, but Liang Zhao's Western Brigade was really good. Although he was reluctant to admit it, it was a fact that he lost to Liang Zhao one after another. After the defeat in the first battle, Anderson gradually calmed down and no longer launched an attack on Pontianak. Instead, he decided to wait for the support of the Dutch-Indonesian authorities. What are your plans next? Make a concerted effort to defeat the Dutch-Indonesian army outside Pontianak. Wen Xian was now looking forward to Liang Zhao's next move. I wonder if you have ever heard of an ancient Greek fable. After the war, Liang Zhao returned to his residence in Pontianak. This city, which was surrounded by the Dutch-Indonesian army, remained calm. People lived their lives as usual. The soldiers of the three sultanates were watching the Dutch-Indonesian prisoners of war in shackles leveling the road surface of the city streets. Soon, the new prisoners were sent over in shackles after completing the registration and became the workers of these old prisoners. These shackles were not cast by Liang Zhao, but prepared by the Dutch-Indonesian authorities for the local natives and Chinese, and the reserves were still sufficient. But they didn't expect that they would have to wear these shackles one day. When the old prisoners saw the arrival of new workers, their expressions became increasingly serious. When the Dutch-Indonesian army first surrounded Pontianak, they were a little excited, thinking that their captive life would soon end. Now it seems that unless the war ends completely, or Liang Zhao and the Dutch-Indonesian authorities exchange prisoners, it will be difficult for them to regain their freedom. Perhaps even exchanging prisoners is a luxury. It seems that so far, the Dutch Indonesian authorities have not captured even a soldier from Liang Zhao's Western Brigade. Thinking of this, even the senior officers among the prisoners felt very frustrated. What fable? I would like to hear the details, Wen Xian said with a smile. Liang Zhao said slowly, once upon a time, there was a shepherd boy. One day, the shepherd boy felt very bored, so he thought of a way to play a prank on everyone for fun. He shouted to the farmers who were farming at the foot of the mountain, "The wolf is coming! The wolf is coming! Help!" The farmers heard the shouting and hurriedly ran up the mountain with hoes and sickles. They shouted as they ran, "Don't be afraid, kid, we are here to help you beat the wolf." The farmers rushed to the mountain panting and saw that there was not even a shadow of the wolf. The shepherd boy laughed at these deceived farmers. After the farmers knew that they had been fooled, they left angrily. The next day, the shepherd boy repeated his old tricks, and the kind farmers rushed up to help him beat the wolf, but still did not see the shadow of the wolf. The shepherd boy laughed at the farmers for being fooled again. Everyone was very angry at the shepherd boy for lying again and again, and they never believed him again. A few days later, the wolf really came. The shepherd boy was so scared that he shouted to the farmers, "The wolf is coming! The wolf is coming! Help! The wolf is really coming!" But this time, no one was willing to believe the shepherd boy, who was a habitual liar. Wen Xian nodded, "I have heard of this Greek fable, and there are similar historical allusions in China." "Oh? Do you know any Chinese historical allusions?" Liang Zhao asked curiously. "I am very interested in Chinese history and culture," Wen Xian smiled. "If I remember correctly, this allusion is called playing tricks on princes with beacons. When I was in Hong Kong, I heard the local bard, or what you call a storyteller, tell this historical allusion." Wen Xian's brain was pretty good. Liang Zhao used the fable of the wolf is coming as an allusion, and he had already thought of what Liang Zhao would do next. Chapter 408. We are pirates now. After the failure of the attack on Pontianak, Anderson has been hiding in the camp and holding his ground. Liang Zhao has no intention of pursuing the Royal Dutch Indonesian Army outside Pontianak. It's not that Liang Zhao doesn't want to eat up the main force of these Dutch Indonesian troops. After all, almost all the living forces of the Dutch Indonesian authorities on the island of Borneo are concentrated in the military camp outside Pontianak. As long as this fresh force can be completely wiped out, the war in West Borneo can come to an end, and this military operation will not be far from victory. Liang Zhao also wants to fight quickly and do not want this war to last too long. However, the fresh force that Pontianak can really rely on at present is only 1,000 people in the Western Brigade. It is more than enough to rely on 1,000 people to defeat Anderson's Dutch Indonesian army, but it is still a bit difficult to eat them completely. Liang Zhao wants to wait for Elvis to return to Pontianak, and then join forces with Kruger on the coastal defense line to surround and eat up Anderson's main force of the Dutch Indonesian army. But before that, Liang Zhao did not intend to let Anderson live in peace. Every night, Liang Zhao either ordered the artillery to fire at the camp of the Dutch Indonesian army, or asked his soldiers to carry scarecrows and shoot at the military camp not far from the Dutch Indonesian army. The Dutch Indonesian army was overwhelmed by the disturbance, and Antti was so angry that he gritted his teeth and sent out scouts to defeat these night attack Chinese troops. When these Dutch Indonesian soldiers approached these Chinese troops, cheering and shooting to death those Chinese troops in their eyes, they suddenly realized that they did not see any shadow of the night attack Chinese soldiers, and the human targets they shot were just scarecrows. Not long after they returned to the camp, they heard the sound of the Chinese army stealing the camp again. Shameless villain! What kind of soldiers are you plotting with these sneaky conspiracies? If you have the guts, let's fight on the battlefield. Anderson, who had not slept peacefully all night, was somewhat nervous and cursed by the news and sound of the Chinese army's night attack on the military camp. The exhausted officers beside Anderson were silent. On the battlefield, we may not be their opponents. The Dutch Indian Army is in a very awkward situation now. They are outside Pontianak City and can neither advance nor retreat. If they advance, they cannot take Pontianak City. If they retreat, they are afraid that the Chinese army will chase them. Now they can only hold their ground in the military camp and wait for Batavia to send reinforcements to support them in attacking Pontianak. Anderson came to the observation tower in front of the military camp gate and saw that in the night, outside their camp, hundreds of kerosene lamps were flying like fireflies in the jungle around their military camp. The light from these kerosene lamps and the sound of gunfire from time to time frightened the guards on duty. Let Al-Qadri cut down all the trees within a 3-mile radius around their camp after dawn, and clear all the bushes and grass. Faced with these Chinese troops who harassed their camp at night, Anderson didn't have any good ideas. Sultan Al-Qadri of the Pontianak Sultanate soon heard about Sultan Akhamuddin of the Sanfa Sultanate's defection to Liang Zhao. After hearing that the Sanfa Sultanate had defected to Liang Zhao did not use the soldiers of the Sanfa Sultanate as human shields and cannon fodder. He just asked them to pave roads, repair houses, and return food. People in Al-Qadri and the Pontianak Sultanate were in turmoil. Many people in the Pontianak Sultanate already thought that it might be a wiser choice to abandon the Dutch and defect to Liang Zhao than to work for the Dutch. Even Al-Qadri himself was shaken. Not only did the war on the land of West Borneo deteriorate sharply for the Dutch Indonesian authorities, but even in the maritime field where they were good at, the situation was getting worse and worse. After the East Indies fleet of the Dutch Indonesian authorities suffered a heavy blow, the keen-smelling pirates soon noticed this. Among these pirates, there were pirates like Li Fengtian, who specialized in plundering Dutch merchant ships at the instruction of Liang Zhao. There were also other pirates who spontaneously plundered Dutch merchant ships. Not to mention pirates, even Hong Mengxiang couldn't help but play the role of a Southeast Asian pirate. He asked his soldiers to change into ordinary people's clothes, pretend to be pirates, and robbed in the Java Sea near Batavia. This sea area has been a forbidden area for Southeast Asian pirates before, because it is the home of the Dutch Indies authorities and the headquarters of the Dutch Indies authorities' East Indies fleet. Only brain-twitching pirates would think of robbing in this sea area. The reason why Hong Mengxiang was so bold and rushed to rob in the Java Sea near Batavia came from the loachboat he owned. The loachboat has a fast speed and can sail regardless of ocean currents and wind direction. The sailing merchant ships they targeted can't run away from them, and the sailing warships chasing them can't catch up with them. Damn it, being a pirate is really a good business with no capital and huge profits. We have been doing it for less than a month, and the brothers' 2-year military pay has been settled. These red barbarians are really rich, Hong Mengxiang's adjutant Kang Ens exclaimed. Is it really that easy to be a pirate? How could Li Fengtian be so awesome? Hong Mengxiang shook his head and laughed. The reason why they have been able to be pirates so easily in the past month is that the East Indies fleet of the Dutch Indies authorities was crippled, and there was a temporary power vacuum in the sea power of the Java Sea. If they really want to continue to be pirates, they will definitely suffer when the Dutch Indies authorities recover. What's more, pirates in Southeast Asia don't have rare things like steamships. And even if they do, ordinary pirates don't have coal to feed steamships. General Hong. Red merchant ships. Another piece of fat meat. Shall we grab it? As he was talking, a captain pointed to the direction of the Dutch merchant ship and reported to Hong Mengxiang. In the past, you were not so active in suppressing pirates when you went out to sea. You wished you wouldn't see pirates. Now that you are pirates, you are all like chicken blood, Hong Mengxiang muttered. The captain just kept grinning in place, waiting for the instructions of the two superiors. Did you see it clearly? It's a Dutch merchant ship? Don't rob a French merchant ship by mistake for a Dutch ship, Kang Ens said. Although he didn't know much about Western countries, he had read the universal history and knew that England and France were among the most powerful countries in Europe, so it was better not to offend them. After all, they came to seek wealth, not to cause trouble. Because the Dutch flag and the French flag are very similar, a week ago, they accidentally robbed a French merchant ship as a Dutch merchant ship. I saw it clearly. The three colors are arranged horizontally. It is undoubtedly a red merchant ship, the captain said very confidently. Kang Ens was still worried, until he personally took a telescope to see it clearly, then nodded to Hong Mengxiang and said, General, it is indeed a Dutch merchant ship, shall we rob it? Hong Mengxiang rolled his eyes at Kang Ens. We are pirates now. If we don't rob merchant ships, are we still pirates? Chapter 409 Relocation. A shower extinguished the afternoon heat in Batavia. The governor's mansion in Batavia. This building, which was built nearly 200 years ago, was the second time that its owner felt so frustrated. The last time the governor of Batavia was so frustrated was when they lost an island called Holmes. The conflict between the Dutch and the Chinese began in Borneo, but after Liang Zhao intervened, the impact of the Dutch-Chinese war was no longer limited to Borneo. Especially after the Battle of Java Sea, the Dutch residents in Batavia began to complain about their lack of living supplies and high prices. Since the era of the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch have ruled this city for 200 years. But the Netherlands, which is based on mercantilism, has never attached importance to industry. Not to mention Batavia, even the industry in the Netherlands is not very developed, and even the shipbuilding industry that they once proud of is weakening at a visible speed. The high quality of life of the upper-class Dutch in Batavia is based on the developed maritime commercial trade. Once the maritime trade route is blocked, their quality of life will inevitably decline. When California announced an embargo on the Dutch-Indonesian authorities, the most that Batavia residents could do was not buy California's cheap and high-quality kerosene. However, there are other products that can replace kerosene. At present, pirates are rampant in the Java Sea, seriously blocking their trade routes. Batavia is now lacking more than just lamp oil. On March 25, 2 merchant ships were attacked by pirates in the Java Sea. One of them was occupied by pirates and the other successfully escaped. According to the crew who escaped back, the ship these pirates were riding was a steamship, not an ordinary pirate. On March 27, an armed merchant ship that responded to the call to Batavia was also attacked by pirates in the Java Sea. Although it escaped successfully, the ship was seriously damaged and is currently undergoing emergency repairs. The assistant of Batavia Governor Tevez was chattering to Tevez about the recent situation, and from time to time he looked up at Tevez's expression. But the governor's expression has not changed at all. From beginning to end, it was as gloomy as this damn weather. Liang Zhao came prepared. Tevez, standing in front of the window, returned to his seat. Since Liang Zhao intervened in the Dutch-Chinese War in Borneo, troubles have been happening one after another. Obviously, this young man of Chinese descent knows where his weakness lies. Without the assistant saying it, Tevez also knows that the rampant pirate activities in the Java Sea must be related to Liang Zhao. Even Liang Zhao himself is involved. But even if he knows, Tevez is helpless now. Before the new maritime force can be assembled, he can only choose to lurk in the undercurrent like a crocodile, waiting for the best time to counterattack. Let the conscripted ships complete the assembly outside the Java Sea before coming to Batavia, Tevez said. But in this case, many conscripted ships may not be able to arrive in Batavia on time, Tevez's assistant said after a moment of hesitation. Compared to time, what we need now is to reduce losses. Tevez's face was full of helplessness. How could he not want to quickly let the conscripted ships complete the assembly, and then quickly give Liang Zhao a thundering blow? I see, sir. The assistant nodded and asked Tevez the next question. Yu Tingfen, the general manager of the Lanfang Company, came to Batavia to surrender to us? How should we deal with this matter? Place them well and monitor their whereabouts, Tevez said. Tevez has learned about the fall of Dongwanlu, but he doesn't know how Liang Zhao will deal with the Lanfang Company. Tevez is not sure whether Yi Tingfen is valuable to him now. There is one more thing, sir. This is bad news, as he said. The assistant handed over a letter. General Anderson has sent troops to the north to surround Pontianak. The current situation in Pontianak is very unfavorable to them. General Anderson requests us to send reinforcements as soon as possible to help him recapture Pontianak. Upon hearing this news, the expression on Tevez's face froze instantly. He was so angry that he jumped up from his seat and couldn't help cursing loudly. Anderson, this bastard, unlike Batavia, which was rainy and cloudy, Sacramento, the capital of California, was sunny and bright at this time. On April 1, 1854. That is, when California ushered in her 4th statehood day, the state government office building, State Assembly Hall, and State Court in Sacramento were finally built. The state government, State Assembly, and State Court no longer had to share an office location with relevant units in San Francisco. The relocation of the state government, State Assembly, and State Court brought a wave of increases in land prices in Sacramento, which had been silent for a long time, and savvy shop owners also took the opportunity to raise the rent of their shops. However, these increases are negligible compared to the increase in land prices in Sacramento at the beginning of the gold rush. The changes in California's administrative, legislative, and judicial centers have a small impact on the lives of ordinary people. For example, in the future, state-level approvals can only be handled in Sacramento, and some lawsuits will be filed in Sacramento courts. But the changes in California's administrative, legislative, and judicial centers have a greater impact on the factory owners and farmers who go in and out of the Congress Hall. The congressmen who settled in Sacramento are naturally very happy, because they don't have to go to San Francisco for meetings in the future. Of course, most congressmen are still not very happy. Because San Francisco is currently the largest, most populous, most economically developed, and most complete city in California. Most of the legislators live in San Francisco. In the future, when they hold meetings, they must take a train from San Francisco to the state capital in Sacramento. Some members who are greedy for petty gains proposed a motion to provide travel allowances for state legislators in the parliament. However, this motion was quickly rejected by Finance Minister Deng Wenhai on the grounds that the state government was in financial difficulties. Governor Robinson and Secretary of State Wen also disagreed with the motion. Afterwards, Deng Wenhai even ridiculed the state legislators who proposed the motion to provide travel allowances for state legislators in public, saying that they were useless state legislators without money. California state legislators are not poor. On the contrary, looking at all the states in the United States, the wealth of California state legislators can even compete with New York state legislators. The legislators who proposed this motion are nothing more than trying to take advantage. The weather is really nice. I hope the relocation of the state government office building, the state assembly hall, and the state court will bring some new atmosphere to Sacramento, Sutter said while looking at the state assembly hall. After the Gold Rush Center moved to Nevada, Sacramento's position became awkward. It was not as good as Nevada in Gold Rush, and not as good as San Francisco in economy. The only thing it could show off was the military industry. It was not as flourishing as San Francisco. Chapter 410. The situation is good. Although California is a new state that was established less than 5 years ago, the coastal economy has already shown a trend of being more developed than the inland economy, and this trend has intensified as the Sacramento gold mine has become increasingly depleted. One of the reasons why the administrative center of California moved from the coast to the inland was to boost the economy of the inland areas and narrow the economic gap between the inland and coastal areas. The overlap of the political center and the economic center makes it easy for resources to overlap in the center. In the long run, this is by no means a good thing. The change of the administrative center made Sutter very happy. Not only Sacramento could benefit from the relocation of the administrative center. Even the legislators in the Sacramento area spoke louder in the state legislature. Yes, the sky in Sacramento is bluer than that in San Francisco, the water is clearer than that in San Francisco, and even the air we breathe is more comfortable than that in San Francisco, Jerwin said. Jerwin did not intend to be sarcastic. The environment in San Francisco, which is industrially developed, is indeed worse than that in Sacramento. The environment in Los Angeles, which started with the oil industry, is even worse. In comparison, after some mining areas were closed one after another, the environment in Sacramento is getting better and better. It is the best one among the 3 major cities in California. Compared with San Francisco, Sacramento is a more suitable city for living. I don't know how the war in Borneo is going. We have postponed the gubernatorial election for half a year. I hope General Liang and Congressman Fremont can catch up with this election, Sutter said. Governor Robinson doesn't want to run for re-election. Jerwin was a little surprised. Governor Robinson wants to go to Kansas, Sutter smiled. After Robinson leaves office, the most suitable candidate for governor is Liang Zhao, followed by Fremont. Considering that Liang Zhao had previously revealed intentionally or unintentionally that he wanted Fremont to be elected as the second governor of California, the candidate for governor after Robinson leaves office is likely to be Fremont. Fremont is the person who has made the greatest contribution to California besides Liang Zhao. They have no objection to letting Fremont serve as governor. Kansas? There is a riot going on there. Why does Robinson go to this muddy water? Jerwin frowned. Since 1854, Kansas, located at the junction of slave states and free states, has become the vortex center of this political struggle. Almost every week, they can receive news of fierce fighting between fanatical abolitionists and fanatical abolitionists in Kansas. At first, it was a fight between the two sides in Kansas, which later evolved into a gunfight. It is said that it has now developed to the point where both sides have brought out cannons to bombard each other. For some people, Kansas is now a muddy water, but for some people, it is an opportunity, Sartre said. The war in Borneo is developing in a direction that is favorable to Liang Zhao. Due to the harassment of pirates, the assembly time of the East Indies fleet of the Dutch Indian authorities was forced to be postponed. This also means that in the short term, the reinforcements that Anderson has been thinking about cannot arrive in West Borneo, which provides Liang Zhao with the possibility of annihilating Anderson's Dutch Indian army. The defeat of the Dutch Indian Army also made the attitude of Pontianak Sultan Al-Qadri towards the Dutch Indian Army increasingly shaken. Al-Qadri sent envoys to contact Liang Zhao many times, expressing their willingness to abandon the Netherlands and surrender to China, hoping that Liang Zhao would accept them. To show his sincerity, Al-Qadri even boldly cut the food supply provided to the Dutch Indian Army. This made Anderson very angry. However, the current situation is very unfavorable to Anderson. Anderson also knows that if the relationship with the Sultanate of Pontianak is strained now, their food supply will be in crisis. At the same time, it will also push Al-Qadri to Liang Zhao's side and stand on the opposite side of himself. Thinking of this, Anderson still endured it. But the more he endured, the angrier he became. Before this, Anderson had never thought that he would be controlled by the natives of Borneo. Governor Wengson was not in a hurry to return to Hong Kong. He planned to stay in Pontianak and continue to observe how Liang Zhao's army fought. As far as Wengson knew, a rising military force in the Qing court, the Yuan, was trained by Liang Zhao. This army was different from other lifeless armies in the Qing court. It was full of vitality and vigor. In the recent wars, they have performed well. Perhaps knowing Liang Zhao's Western Brigade can also help us understand the Guangdong Brave to a certain extent. At the same time, Wen Xian also sent a message to the Hong Kong garrison, preparing to let the British East India Company occupy the northern part of Borneo while Liang Zhao and the Dutch Indonesian authorities were fighting. After all, he and Liang Zhao had already signed a treaty in black and white, and the first occupant of North Borneo would get it first. Liang Zhao was not in a hurry to drive Wen Xian away. When the war in West Borneo entered the final stage, he also needed an intermediary to mediate the negotiations between him and the Dutch Indonesian authorities. Wen Xian, as the governor of Hong Kong, was a good candidate for a mediator. Wen Xian's intention to stay in Pontianak was not simple, and Liang Zhao had already seen this. Wen Xian wanted to visit the Bold several times, but Liang Zhao refused for various reasons. After Elvis returned to Pontianak, the time to annihilate the main force of the Dutch Indonesian army in West Borneo finally came. In addition to the 500 Umbrella Company mercenaries who were left in Dongwonlu to maintain order in the occupied area, the main forces of the Western Brigade have gathered in Pontianak and the coastal defense line at the mouth of the Kapuas River. We have captured many senior officials of the Lanfang Company in Dongwonlu, but unfortunately, the two main culprits, Liu Shaoshan and Yi Dingfen, are missing. We have turned the entire Dongwonlu upside down and found no trace of them, Elvis said with regret. Most likely they have gone to the Dutch. They will have to settle accounts sooner or later. Even if they go to Amsterdam, I have a way to bring them to justice. Liang Zhao was not surprised by this, and he said to Elvis, "Let the brothers eat, drink and sleep well. Tomorrow, we will have a decisive battle with the Dutch Indonesian army." Decisive battle? Elvis was a little surprised. Yes, a decisive battle, Liang Zhao smiled. The main forces of the Dutch Indian Army in West Borneo are all outside Pontianak. Is their commander crazy? Instead of defending Kendlangan, he brought the main forces to the outside of Pontianak for us to eat? It seems that Anderson's reputation as a famous general is just a name without substance. Elvis couldn't understand the train of thought of the Dutch Indian commander. At present, the Dutch Indian authorities have temporarily lost control of the sea and are suffering from supply difficulties. Sending troops to surround Pontianak at this time is simply giving up all their advantages and using their own weaknesses to attack the enemy's strengths. Elvis has always heard that Anderson is a famous general of the Dutch Indian Army, and he is a presence that makes the chiefdoms on the island of Borneo shudder. However, after Anderson's series of operations, it is difficult for Elvis to recognize that Anderson is a famous general. Elvis even feels that Anderson is not even a qualified commander. Famous general? Just an incompetent famous general. After several rounds of fighting, Liang Zhao also felt that he overestimated Anderson and the Dutch Indian Army. The so-called famous general of the Dutch Indian Army was nothing but Anderson's self-praise. Even in the Dutch-Chinese War, Anderson's performance was not outstanding or worthy of praise. Based on the intelligence collected, Liang Zhao judged that Batavia would not be able to provide reinforcements to Anderson for at least 1 to 2 weeks. Liang Zhao sent a telegram to Fremont and Kruger on the coast, asking them to prepare to launch a general attack on the main force of the Dutch Indian Army led by Anderson tomorrow, and annihilate the main force of the Dutch Indian Army in West Borneo in one fell swoop. Chapter 411 Camp Rower. faced with the Chinese Army's night harassment for days. The Dutch Indian Army outside Pontianak has not slept well for 2 weeks. During the days of the siege, there were gunshots around their camp almost every night. At first, the Dutch Indian Army would send troops to guard against the Chinese Army sneaking into the camp. But after 2 weeks, they found that the Chinese Army was just pretending to harass them and had no intention of attacking their camp. Therefore, in the end, the Dutch Indian Army, from Anderson himself to ordinary Dutch Indian soldiers, were accustomed to the Chinese Army's pretense at night. No one thought that the Chinese Army would launch a night attack on them at night. The Dutch Indian Army also relaxed its defense against the Chinese Army at night. This time, the wolf is really here, looking at the Western Brigade soldiers who were gathering and checking their weapons and equipment, when Xian teased. At the same time, when Xian recorded these experiences word for word in the notebook he carried with him. The world knows very little about this army that is isolated in the borderland of America, and even has some disdain. However, when Xian now believes that this is an armed force that cannot be underestimated. The professionalism and combat quality shown by this army are not inferior to the armies of European powers. Let's give General Anderson a surprise tonight, Liang Zhao rubbed his hands and said confidently as he looked at the soldiers of the Western Brigade who were gathering in an orderly manner. I'm afraid your prisoner of war camp will have to be expanded again, Wen Xian sighed. Through these days of observation, Wen Xian now does not think that Liang Zhao is an arrogant person. Wen Xian's point of view is the same as Liang Zhao's, thinking that this is a battle without suspense. The exhausted and lacking supplies of the Dutch Indian Army are no match for the high-spirited soldiers of the Western Brigade. After the troops were assembled, Liang Zhao took out his pocket watch and saw the current time clearly with the light from the kerosene lamp. It is now 11 o'clock in the evening. In the past, at this time, he would always be as punctual as an alarm clock, firing guns and even firecrackers for the Dutch Indian Army outside Pontianak to help them sleep, and today is of course no exception. Attack! Liang Zhao put away his pocket watch and issued the order to attack. The dense gunfire sounded as expected. The officers and soldiers of the artillery company fired shells into the Dutch Indian Army's barracks as if they were free. However, the Dutch Indian Army, which had long been immune to the sound of gunfire, did not react to the sudden sound of gunfire. Exhausted, they just wanted to have a good sleep now. Some Dutch Indian soldiers even blocked their ears with cotton and rags before going to bed. The first to react was the sentry on duty. The sentries first noticed that the gunfire tonight was particularly dense. When the explosive bombs fell into the barracks one after another, and even 3 or 5 sentries were killed on the spot by the explosive bombs, the sentries finally reacted. Today, the Chinese Army is not just playing a show, but really going to attack at night. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! The sentries shouted. Upon learning that the Chinese Army was attacking at night, Anderson hurriedly put on his military uniform, put on his saber and walked out of the tent to organize the army to counterattack. But the next scene surprised Anderson himself. The Dutch Indian Army was exhausted and mentally exhausted by the long-term fraudulent attacks by the Chinese Army. Many Dutch Indian soldiers were already on the verge of collapse. Hearing the enemy attack, many highly nervous Dutch Indian soldiers picked up their guns, loaded bullets, and shot at anyone they saw. It was difficult to distinguish between the enemy and ourselves at night. The sudden gunshots in the camp also made many Dutch Indian soldiers who were still mentally normal mistakenly believe that Liang Zhao's Chinese army had entered the camp. They also picked up their weapons and shot at anyone they saw. The soldiers of the Pontianak Sultanate, who had long been dissatisfied with the Dutch Indian Army, also took advantage of the chaos to attack the nervous Dutch Indian soldiers or picked up rifles on the ground to attack the Dutch Indian Army. The entire Dutch Indian Army camp was instantly in chaos. Camp roar. Hearing the chaotic and disorderly gunshots coming from the Dutch Indian Army camp, Liang Zhao couldn't help but raise the telescope in his hand and carefully observe the situation in the Dutch Indian Army camp. However, under the darkness of the night, Liang Zhao couldn't see any clues. General, half of the shells have been fired. The commander of the artillery company came to Liang Zhao to report that they had fired half of the shells. Keep firing, Liang Zhao ordered. Based on my years of service experience, there is a high probability that a camp roar occurred in the Dutch Indian Army's barracks, Elvis said. If it is a camp roar, let them continue to fight for a while. We cannot join in the fun for now. I am afraid that the Dutch Indian Army is putting on a show for us and missed the opportunity to fight, Deng Wenkang said. Mr. Deng, you think too highly of the Dutch Indian Army. It is not surprising that an army that can be frightened by dozens of stragglers and abandon Pontianak City will have a camp roar. Elvis still insisted on his point of view. Not long after, the Pontianak Sultanate soldiers who ran out of the Dutch Indian Army's barracks also confirmed Elvis's view that a camp roar did occur in the Dutch Indian Army's barracks. At midnight, hearing the gunfire in the Dutch Indian Army camp gradually sparse, Liang Zhao ordered the infantry to approach the Dutch Indian Army camp and surround it. At this time, Kruger also arrived in Pontianak from the coast of the Kapuas River estuary with 2 battalions, and completed the encirclement of the Dutch Indian Army camp together with the Pontianak garrison. When the sky was just getting light and the east was wide, the Dutch Indian Army camp barely restored order. After the camp roar in the middle of the night, the Dutch Indian Army camp was already in a mess. The Dutch Indian Army suffered heavy casualties, with nearly 1/3 of the soldiers either dead or injured in the camp roar and lost their combat effectiveness. Although the Dutch Indian Army still has about 3,000 troops. But obviously, these Dutch Indian troops with extremely low morale no longer have the courage to fight. Looking at the Hulai camp and the embarrassed soldiers, Anderson, with messy hair and confused eyes, stood there for a long time and couldn't speak. It's over, everything is over, Anderson muttered incoherently. He knew very well that the camp roar at night had sentenced him to death in his career. Anderson had thought about losing to Liang Zhao's Western Brigade on the battlefield, but he didn't expect that he would fail in such a humiliating way. General, the Chinese army has surrounded our camp. Should we continue to fight or surrender? A colonel of the Dutch Indian Army bravely stepped forward and asked, and did not forget to add a sentence after speaking. The Chinese army has a lot of people, a full brigade, or even more. Anderson smiled bitterly. Whether to fight or surrender, you all have the answer in your hearts. Why do you ask me? After speaking, Anderson collapsed on the mud mixed with blood. Even if he wanted to fight to the death now, not to mention the Java native soldiers in the army, even the European soldiers and these officers would probably not listen to his orders and fight to the death with the Chinese army. Moreover, their reinforcements were still far away, and they could not hold on until the day when the reinforcements arrived. Such resistance was futile and meaningless in the eyes of these officers. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 412 Surrender. After a moment, Anderson stood up, took a deep breath, and walked back to his tent with steady steps under the gaze of the officers of the Royal Netherlands and the Dutch Indochina Army. When Anderson appeared in front of these officers of the Royal Netherlands and the Dutch Indochina Army again, he had changed into a clean general's uniform, and even the beard on his face was carefully groomed. The whole person looked much more energetic. Anderson ordered the guards to make a white flag and prepare to go out of the camp to discuss surrender with Liang Zhao. Although they still have sufficient ammunition reserves, their food reserves are not abundant. After last night's marketing, the Dutch Indochina Army suffered heavy casualties. Anderson's eyes swept over the wounded soldiers, many of whom were veterans who followed him to Batavia 8 years ago. Many of these soldiers were recruited by him in the Netherlands and the Flemish region of Belgium before he set off. Now, not only can the military doctors accompanying the army not treat so many wounded soldiers, but even medicines are scarce. Before leaving Kendalingen, out of prejudice against people of color, Anderson still did not put away his contempt for Liang Zhao, thinking that the army under Liang Zhao, which was a mixture of Chinese and white people of various races, was just a mob with no cohesion. As long as he was serious, Liang Zhao's army would be vulnerable to his brave and fearless Royal Dutch and Indochina Army. He never thought that the mob was actually themselves. Therefore, Anderson was not fully prepared for this expedition. For this, he paid a painful price. Thinking of this, Anderson could not help but feel guilty. Soon, the guards made a white flag, and Anderson took the white flag from the guards with a heavy heart. Although the officers of the officer corps and most of the European soldiers of the Dutch and Indochina Army wanted to surrender to save their lives, when they saw the dazzling white flag, they still lowered their once proud heads in shame. In the East Indies, whether it was Sumatra, Java, or the current Borneo, only the enemy raised the white flag and surrendered like them. This was the first time since the establishment of the Dutch Indian Army that the army surrendered on such a large scale. Raise your heads. Anderson's hand only held the flagpole of the white flag. This might be the last time he gave a speech to the officers and soldiers of the Dutch Indian Army. Under Anderson's order, the officers and European soldiers of the Dutch Indian Army slowly raised their heads. As for the Javanese soldiers, who were more numerous than the European soldiers, they did not feel anything. They were never the core armed force of the Dutch Indian Army. To put it bluntly, they were cannon fodder, and to put it nicely, they were just high-level cannon fodder. These Javanese soldiers did not have a strong sense of belonging to the Dutch Indian Army. As a member of the Royal Netherlands East India Army, you have fulfilled your duties and are all qualified soldiers and officers. The reason for this defeat is not you, but my rashness. You don't have to feel guilty about failure and surrender. After the war, I may be sent to a military court, and I may be sent to prison in the end. But most of you will continue to serve in the glorious Royal Netherlands East India Army. I hope you can remember today's lessons, remember the enemies we fought today. And don't repeat the same mistakes. Finally, it is the greatest honor and the most unforgettable thing in my life to work with you. After speaking, Anderson bowed deeply to the officers and soldiers of the Dutch East India Army, and then walked out of the barracks and walked towards the enemies who surrounded them. Trying to get good surrender conditions for his soldiers as much as possible and let more people survive is the only thing Anderson can do for his subordinates now. The number of European soldiers in the Royal Netherlands East India Army is not large, and the Dutch East India authorities cannot afford to lose more soldiers. Surrender is also the only thing they can do now that they are surrounded. Just when Anderson made up his mind to surrender. On the Western Brigade side, Liang Zhao's two subordinates, Elvis and Kruger, were fighting for the right to attack for their troops. Elvis hoped that Arizona could take on the task of the main attack, with the California Infantry Regiment and the Oregon Infantry Regiment as the reserve, on the grounds that the Arizona Infantry Regiment had more combat experience. Kruger, on the other hand, hoped that the Oregon Infantry Regiment could take on the task of the main attack, so that his soldiers could get more training, on the grounds that the Oregon Infantry Regiment needed more actual combat experience. The colonels of the two Western brigades argued, each holding their own opinions. As for Liang Zhao, he was inclined to give the main attack task to Kruger's Oregon Infantry Regiment. As a newly established infantry regiment, the Oregon Infantry Regiment did need more actual combat experience to improve and prove itself. I don't think there's any need for the two colonels to argue. The Dutch have surrendered, when Xian pointed in the direction of the Dutch Indian Army camp. A senior officer of the Dutch Indian Army came out of the barracks in a neat uniform, holding a conspicuous white flag. The Dutch Indian Army surrendered, and Wen Xian missed an opportunity to observe how the Western Brigade fought. This made Wen Xian feel a little disappointed and regretful. The surrender of the Dutch Indian Army was also within Liang Zhao's expectations. The concepts between the East and the West are quite different, and the attitudes of the two sides towards surrender are also different. As long as you complete your own combat mission, surrendering in the hopeless situation of winning and saving your life is allowed, and it is not a very shameful thing. Especially the Dutch, who are deeply influenced by mercantilism, they cherish their lives more. Welcome the guests, Liang Zhao said lightly. After handing in the weapons he was carrying, Anderson was led to Liang Zhao. Anderson was neither young nor old, about 50 years old. He was also tall, just slightly shorter than Liang Zhao. Although Anderson looked much more energetic after some tidying up, he still couldn't hide his fatigue. I guess you are General Liang. Anderson looked at the senior commander of the Western Brigade standing in front of him. Liang Zhao was not wearing a general's uniform, but a shirt more casually. Because the weather in Borneo is humid and hot, Liang Zhao even cut off the sleeves of the shirt. As for his feet, Liang Zhao also changed into rubber-soled slippers specially brought from San Francisco. The reason why Liang Zhao wore this way was not to deliberately humiliate Anderson, but it was more comfortable to wear this way in Pontianak. Anderson had basically no dealings with the U.S. Army. And even if Anderson had dealt with the U.S. Army, given the complicated uniforms of the U.S. Army and the fact that senior officers were allowed to customize their own uniforms, it would be difficult for Anderson to distinguish the rank of a U.S. Army commander from his uniform. Not to mention Anderson, even Liang Zhao might not be able to judge the rank of an Army colleague by his uniform. Based on Liang Zhao's age and his extraordinary temperament when surrounded by two colonels, Anderson deduced that this young man in casual clothing was the opponent he had faced in recent days. Chapter 413 Leftovers. That's right, Liang Zhao replied with his hands behind his back. Your army is the strongest opponent I have ever encountered in the East Indies. I am convinced that I was defeated by the American army led by you, Anderson said. Although Anderson had not taken Liang Zhao seriously before, at the moment of defeat and surrender, Anderson chose to admit the strength of the enemy. If the enemy is weak and he is defeated by a weak enemy, wouldn't it mean that he is even more incompetent? Only by being defeated by a strong enemy, Anderson and his Dutch-Indonesian army will not appear so unbearable. Liang Zhao is an American general, and his army is an American army. Anderson kept instilling this view into this, which was his last comfort and excuse, or fig leaf. Before that, Anderson was more willing to compare Liang Zhao with the officers and generals of the Qing dynasty, and agreed that Liang Zhao's army was an army composed of yellow people. Even though Liang Zhao's army was actually a mixture of most Chinese and white people of various ethnic groups. After losing Pontianak and fleeing to Kendlangen in a panic, Anderson did not think that the Dutch Indian army was defeated by Liang Zhao's army. It was because of the shameless sneak attack by the other side that the Dutch Indian army lost Pontianak without any preparation. It was not until Anderson witnessed a failure of the Dutch Indian Army's attack on Pontianak and paid a huge price in casualties but still did not achieve any results. Anderson, who was late to realized that the Dutch Indian Army was really no match for Liang Zhao's elite division. Liang Zhao's army was fundamentally different from the armed forces of the Chinese Resistance Company in West Borneo and the army of the Qing dynasty. But when Anderson understood this, it was too late. His army fell into an embarrassing dilemma outside Pontianak until it was completely defeated and lost the ability to challenge Liang Zhao's Western Brigade. Liang Zhao knew that Anderson was just trying to flatter himself and the Dutch Indian Army, but as long as the Dutch Indian Army was willing to surrender, Liang Zhao was too lazy to bother with Anderson about these trivial things. Since Anderson wanted to save face, he would give him some face and let him surrender with dignity. General Anderson is also one of the few strong enemies Liang has encountered in his military career. As soon as he said this, Liang Zhao felt that he couldn't hold it back. He turned his head and laughed softly. After he was able to effectively control his facial expressions, Liang Zhao turned his head and said to Anderson very seriously, "As long as your army lays down its weapons and surrenders, I will guarantee the personal safety of the European officers and soldiers in your army. The East Indies fleet of the Dutch-Indonesian authorities can be called a strong enemy." After all, Liang Zhao achieved his strategic goal after paying a huge price in the Battle of Java Sea. The Royal Dutch East Indies Army is just a scrap, but it can't be called a strong enemy. Since landing on land, Liang Zhao's Western Brigade has been fighting smoothly. The casualties caused to him by the Dutch-Indonesian Army, the Lanfang Army, and the local Sultan chiefdom are far less serious than the casualties caused by tropical diseases to the Western Brigade. There are still many Javanese in our army, Anderson emphasized. Liang Zhao laughed up to the sky upon hearing this, and then asked Anderson a soul-searching question, "Is Batavia willing to pay a ransom for the Javanese soldiers?" Liang Zhao treated European prisoners of war differently from indigenous prisoners of war because the Dutch-Indonesian authorities would pay a ransom for European prisoners of war. He would be able to get back the food, clothing, and shelter of these prisoners of war with interest at the negotiation table in the future. As for the indigenous soldiers, who were mainly native to Java, the Dutch-Indonesian authorities did not care about the lives of these native soldiers. There was no shortage of people in Sumatra and Java, and it was much more cost-effective to recruit new soldiers than to spend money to redeem these native soldiers and prisoners of war. Of course, another deeper reason why Liang Zhao treated European prisoners of war differently from indigenous prisoners of war was that he needed a large number of cheap labor to open up rubber plantations on a large scale after the war. These strong Javanese soldiers were undoubtedly an excellent cheap labor resource and could contribute to the future banana plantation business in Borneo. For some well-known reasons, Liang Zhao did not have a good impression of the natives of the East Indies, but rather hated them. Anderson was speechless. He could not refute Liang Zhao's question. If the number of native soldiers captured was not large, the Dutch-Indonesian authorities might be willing to make a show of spending some Dutch guilders to redeem these native soldiers and win people's hearts. But the problem is that Liang Zhao has at least 3,000 native soldiers, mainly Javanese. Since the establishment of the Royal Dutch East Indies Army, it is the first time that such a large number of Dutch-Indonesian soldiers have been captured. Even if Liang Zhao is kind and only offers a ransom of 100 Dutch guilders for each native prisoner, it is a huge sum of 300,000 Dutch guilders. And to recruit a strong Javanese soldier on Java Island, the Dutch Indonesian authorities only need to pay 20 Dutch guilders, or even less than 20 Dutch guilders. Choosing between native soldiers and European soldiers is not a difficult multiple-choice question for Anderson. As for conscience? If Anderson is a conscientious person, he would not choose to leave the Netherlands and serve in the East Indies. As long as you provide treatment for the wounded and officers of the Dutch Indian Army and provide us with enough food to fill our stomachs, I have no objection to how you deal with these native soldiers. After a moment of silence, Anderson said slowly. Liang Zhao nodded and agreed to Anderson's not excessive request. After Anderson's fresh troops of the Dutch Indian authorities on Borneo Island surrendered, he had no worries on land and freed up troops to occupy the last colonial stronghold of the Dutch Indian authorities in West Borneo, Kenduangan. After signing the surrender letter, Anderson's Dutch Indian Army formally surrendered. Anderson also cooperated with Liang Zhao's work very well, and ordered his officers to bring the European soldiers to surrender to Liang Zhao's Western Brigade in an organized manner. Thanks to Anderson's cooperation, the entire surrender process went very smoothly. The Dutch Indian Army handed over their weapons, and after completing the registration, they obediently went to the prisoner of war camp that had been prepared for them. After the Dutch Indonesian soldiers of European descent left as prisoners of war, only the short, thin and dark Javanese soldiers were left in the camp. These Javanese soldiers were cleaning up the bodies in the camp. For some time to come, this will also be the residence of these Javanese prisoners of war. Liang Zhao walked into the camp of the Dutch Indonesian Army. These Javanese soldiers looked at Liang Zhao and the guards around him in fear, feeling very nervous. In the 40-year-long Dutch-Chinese War, the blood debts of the Chinese on the hands of these Javanese soldiers were no less than those of the Dutch. Sometimes, slaves who take advantage of the power of others are even worse than their Dutch masters in doing evil. A black slave in the southern slave states can be sold for a good price of more than $2,000. What do you think these Javanese soldiers can be sold for? Liang Zhao pointed at these trembling Javanese soldiers and asked the people around him. Are you going to sell them as slaves to the slave states? Fremont frowned and reminded Liang Zhao at the same time. You are now a prominent figure in the military and political circles. If you openly trade in slaves, it will have a bad impact on you and on California. Although Fremont was not a fanatical abolitionist, he still opposed the sale of these Java natives to America. Chapter 414, Releasing Goodwill. Sell them to the slave states in the South? That's not a good deal. Liang Zhao shook his head decisively. What Fremont said made sense. At present, the slaveholders and the abolitionists were at loggerheads. If slaves were traded openly in the United States, they would probably end up being neither Chinese nor foreign. Although the abolitionists in the North did not intend to abolish slavery for the sake of abolition, the current black slave issue in the United States was like the racial issue in the United States in later generations, the environmental issue in the European Union, and some topics that could not be touched. It has become a political correctness that has nothing to do with reality. So what do you plan to do with these native prisoners of war? Fremont looked down at the natives wearing the uniforms of the Dutch Indonesian Army. Send them back, or hire them as mercenaries of the umbrella company. The food, drink, defecation and urination of more than 3,000 people is a considerable expense. Liang Zhao has never been a person who is willing to suffer losses, so he naturally would not support these native prisoners of war in vain. They have a history of serving the Dutch Indonesian Army, so they are not suitable to be hired forces of the umbrella company. Liang Zhao did not have this plan, he said. The Umbrella Mercenary Group is a military organization, not a trash can. The military quality of these natives does not meet the standards of becoming the umbrella company's mercenary group. There are enough Chinese populations in West Borneo. Compared with recruiting local natives, Liang Zhao prefers to recruit Chinese with the same cultural background. Indeed, these scattered Southeast Asian natives are not a good source of soldiers. Kruger also agreed with Liang Zhao's point of view. The Chinese are indeed better soldiers than these natives. Britain and the Netherlands hired local soldiers to maintain their rule in the colonies because their core population was not enough, but Liang Zhao did not have such troubles. Liang Zhao has the same cultural background and can use the quasi-core population of nearly one-third of the world's population. There is no need to recruit local natives as military and police to maintain rule. Let them open up rubber plantations. I will ask someone to get more rubber seedlings from Brazil. After the war is over, they will be packaged and sold to California merchants with the plantations, Liang Zhao said. It takes a lot of labor to open up plantations. As long as they have a whip in their hands, these natives of the Indonesian archipelago are good labor. Isn't this still slavery? Fremont couldn't help but tease. Slavery is only a means, not an end, Liang Zhao laughed. What's more, this is Borneo, not the mainland of America. There is no damn political problem. After leaving the military camp, Liang Zhao returned to his residence in Pontianak. The fresh troops of the Dutch Indian Army on the island of Borneo were annihilated. The next issue Liang Zhao had to consider was not victory or defeat, but how to expand the results of the war. Liang Zhao gave Elvis Arizona Infantry Regiment 2 tasks. One was to sail south to capture Kendlangan, which was short of troops. The second was to withdraw a battalion to cooperate with the Umbrella Company mercenaries in Dongwonlu and go north to the Sultanate of Brunei. After Elvis received the order and walked out of Liang Zhao's office, Liang Zhao immediately drafted 2 more letters. One was written to Sartre, telling Sartre that the overall situation in West Borneo had been settled and that a California consortium could be organized to come to Borneo for a commercial investigation. As for the other letter, it was written to the governor of Batavia, Tevez. Its content was nothing more than demanding that the Dutch Indian authorities withdraw from Borneo and that the two sides restore peace. Now not only the whole West Borneo is in Liang Zhao's pocket, but also the South Borneo region controlled by the Dutch Indies authorities is in danger. Even after the Battle of Java, Liang Zhao has gained temporary control of the sea and blockaded Batavia because the Dutch Indies fleet of the Dutch Indies authorities was seriously injured. Liang Zhao has mastered enough negotiation capital and his strategic goal has basically been achieved. It is time to send a signal of peace talks to the Dutch Indies authorities. After writing the letter, Liang Zhao asked someone to call Governor Bonham of Hong Kong. He hoped that Bonham could send the letter to Batavia on his behalf. Bonham was a smart man. He knew that Liang Zhao hoped to use his status as the governor of Hong Kong to facilitate peace talks between Liang Zhao and the Dutch Indies authorities. You have eliminated the main force of the Dutch Indies army. Now is the time to expand the results of the war. You can take all the Borneo regions except North Borneo and then negotiate with the Dutch Indies authorities, Bonham said with his hands behind his back and a smile. Compared with the peace talks between the two sides, Wangson hoped that Liang Zhao could fight a protracted war with the Dutch Indies authorities, preferably a protracted war with a difficult outcome to weaken the Dutch Indies authorities' rule over the East Indies. Wangson had already reported in detail to the Governor-General of India, Earl Dalhousie, on the war on Borneo Island, and believed that this battle was likely to change the power structure of the entire Southeast Asia in the future. In view of the limited garrison forces on Hong Kong Island, Wangson hoped that the Governor-General of India, Earl Dalhousie, could lend a hand and send troops to assist him in occupying North Borneo. However, the Governor-General of India, Earl Dalhousie, was indeed not very interested in this matter. Earl Dalhousie believed that the strategic focus of the British Empire was in the Near East. It was not a wise move to make enemies with the Netherlands at this time, and it was not on the interests of the British Empire. Wangson was also helpless about this. Since the Governor-General of India was unwilling to lend a hand, he could only pin his hopes on the cabinet and parliament in London. But this would take time. The purpose of our expedition to Borneo this time is to protect the overseas Chinese, not to fight for the sake of war. Since our goal has been achieved, there is no reason to continue this war. You are proficient in sinology, so you must know how to write the Chinese character. Liang Zhao said in a high-sounding manner. If possible, Liang Zhao certainly hopes to swallow the entire island of Borneo. It's a pity that his digestive capacity is limited, and he can't digest the entire island of Borneo for the time being. West Borneo and North Borneo have a considerable number of Chinese populations. Liang Zhao directly occupied these places, and the management cost was relatively low. However, there were not many Chinese populations in South Borneo and East Borneo. In addition, after the Dutch Indonesian authorities colonized South Borneo and East Borneo, in order to maintain their rule in the new colony, they systematically cleansed the Chinese in these areas, resulting in basically no Chinese in South Borneo and East Borneo. If Liang Zhao wanted to rule South Borneo and East Borneo, the cost of ruling would be incomparable to that of West Borneo and North Borneo. To stop war is to use force. You are not only a person who knows how to start a war, but also a person who knows how to stop a war at the right time. Wangson smiled. I am willing to go for you, He knew that Liang Zhao was willing to negotiate with the Dutch Indonesian authorities at this time, not because Liang Zhao was kind-hearted, but because Liang Zhao wanted to stop while he was ahead. Wangsun must want us to continue fighting with the Dutch? Is it reliable to let Wangsun go to Batavia? The British have always been cunning. I am worried that Wangsun's visit will not only fail to promote peace talks between us and the Dutch Indonesian authorities, but will add fuel to the fire. Deng Wenkang expressed his concerns. No matter who is sent to Batavia, the result will be the same. I sent Wangsun there just to show goodwill to Batavia and show that we are willing to negotiate, Liang Zhao said. The Dutch Indonesian authorities still have the East Indies fleet in their hands. As long as they have this card in their hands, they will think that they still have the possibility of turning the tables and will not accept peace talks. Chapter 415 Everything will be fine. The news that the Dutch Indian Army on Borneo was completely wiped out quickly reached the governor's office in Batavia. The governor of Batavia, Tevez, who learned the news first, was like being struck by a bolt from the blue. Tevez was stunned in place, his face full of astonishment. He once thought that there was something wrong with his hearing. More than 4,000 people, a brigade of troops, were gone in such a short time? After recovering from his shock, Tevez's expression gradually became solemn. The Dutch Indian Army was defeated so badly in West Borneo that resigning was the best result for him. For a time, Tevez was actually confused. Liang Zhao was able to swallow more than 4,000 new Dutch Indian troops on Borneo, which meant that if Tevez wanted to turn the situation around, he had to send at least tens of thousands of Dutch Indian soldiers to West Borneo. The total strength of the Dutch Indian Army in the entire East Indies region of the Dutch Indian authorities was only more than 29,000 people. Excluding the more than 4,000 people who were lost in West Borneo, the total strength of the Dutch Indian Army was only more than 25,000. Among these 25,000 Dutch Indian Army, more than two-thirds were indigenous soldiers with low combat literacy. Of course, it does not mean that if the Dutch Indian Army has 25,000 people, Tevez can mobilize 25,000 people to fight in West Borneo. The Dutch Indian authorities need the Dutch Indian Army to maintain order in their colonies in the East Indies, and it is impossible to withdraw all the troops. Tevez can only squeeze out 5,000 to 6,000 mobile troops. In the past, the 5,000 to 6,000 Dutch Indian Army was a terrifying armed force in the East Indies, and even in the entire Southeast Asia. However, according to the intelligence from the front line, the 5,000 to 6,000 Dutch Indian Army did not seem to have any advantage against Liang Zhao's Western Brigade. Cruzen, when can our fleet be assembled? Tevez asked the commander of the East Indies fleet, Cruzen, in a very stern tone. He now seemed very impatient. The Navy, the Dutch Indonesian authorities' maritime power in the East Indies, has now become Tevez's only hope. Since Liang Zhao intervened in the Dutch-Chinese War on Borneo, the East Indies fleet led by Cruzen is one of the few armed forces that can inflict heavy damage on Liang Zhao. Although Liang Zhao has been promoting their victory in the Battle of Java, Batavia has always sneered at this matter. They do not think that the East Indies fleet, which was the first to withdraw from the battlefield, is the defeated party. The East Indies fleet is just making tactical adjustments. Even Tevez himself believes this statement, believing that the East Indies fleet is not without the ability to completely wipe out Liang Zhao's patchwork of miscellaneous maritime forces, but that the East Indies fleet has not completed mobilization. However, Cruzen, an eyewitness of this naval battle, does not think so. The mobilization capability is originally part of the fleet's strength. Cruzen still remembers the steam giants wrapped in iron sheets and with strange gun layouts that he saw in the Battle of Java. These steamships with thick protection and sharp artillery, not to mention the East Indies fleet, even if the Royal Netherlands Navy came, it might not be easy to take them down. Of course, this is just a thought. Cruzen knew very well that the Royal Netherlands Navy would not directly intervene in the war. If the Royal Netherlands Navy intervened, the American Navy naturally had reasons to intervene, which was a situation that the Dutch Indonesian authorities did not want to see. Although the United States is not a first-class power, its size is still scary enough compared to the Netherlands. It stands to reason that the battlefield is in Borneo Island and the Java Sea area, and the Dutch Indonesian authorities have the advantage of fighting at home. It's just that the Dutch authorities have been keen on plundering the raw materials of the East Indies and squeezing the commercial value of the East Indies for 200 years since they colonized the East Indies, and the construction of the East Indies is very limited. Even in Batavia, the most developed in the East Indies, the handicraft industry is not very developed. Not to mention the industry that is lacking even in the Netherlands. The weak industrial base means that the war potential of the East Indies is very limited. Not only can the East Indies not produce warships, but even guns and cannons rely on local supplies. The voyage from San Francisco to Borneo Island is obviously shorter than the voyage from Amsterdam to Batavia. If you don't care about the cost, our fleet can be assembled within 3 weeks. But as a naval commander, I don't recommend you do this. The East India Fleet is our last barrier. If there is any mishap with the East India Fleet, it will take us at least 4 to 5 months to get support from the mainland, Cruzan said after a moment of silence. 4 to 5 months, Tevez shook his head. If Batavia continues to be blockaded like this, let alone 4 to 5 months, I'm afraid it may not last even a month. Batavia's trade routes must be restored as soon as possible. Tevez can't wait for 4 to 5 months. If Batavia continues to be blockaded like this for 4 to 5 months, even if Liang Zhao doesn't come, there will be chaos inside. He, Tevez, can bear the pain of material shortages, but the young men who came to Batavia from the mainland to gild themselves can't bear this pain, and the shop owners and citizens of Batavia can't stand the lack of goods flowing into Batavia for a long time. But Sir, Cruzan wanted to dissuade Tevez, hoping that Tevez would not rashly use the last card in their hand. After the setbacks on both the sea and the land, it was difficult for them to bear another big defeat. If Tevez did this, what would be the difference between him and Anderson, who underestimated the enemy and became a prisoner? As long as our navy gathers together, everything will be fine, General Cruzan. I will give you 4 weeks. After 4 weeks, you must regain control of the sea. Warships sailing on the ocean are far more deterrent than warships lying in the dock. Now even pirates dare to run wild in the waters near Batavia. As the highest naval commander in the East Indies, can you remain indifferent? Tevez interrupted Cruzan, waved his hand at Cruzan and said, "Execute the order, General Cruzan." "Yes, Your Excellency the Governor." Cruzan had no choice but to agree. The only thing he could do now was to hurry up to repair the damaged warships and let more armed merchant ships gather in Batavia so that he would have a considerable maritime force available in 4 weeks. "Your Excellency the Governor, the British Governor of Hong Kong, Bonham, wants to see you." While the two were talking, Tevez's assistant knocked on the door gently and asked cautiously, "Governor of Hong Kong? See you?" Tevez didn't know what Bonham's purpose was in going to Batavia at this time, but it would be better to meet the British governor. The relationship with Britain was a diplomatic relationship that the governor of Batavia needed to prioritize, but Tevez had more interactions with the British governor of the Straits, that is, the governor of Malacca. The interactions with the governor of Hong Kong were not deep. Tevez's attitude towards the British was complicated. Britain and the Netherlands were both European partners in colonizing Southeast Asia and competitors. Tevez had previously been wary and dissatisfied with the British for including the Sarawak region of Borneo in the sphere of influence of the British Empire. Chapter 416, Settlement of Accounts. In the eyes of the Dutch Indonesian authorities, the British Empire already had enough colonies and they were vast enough, so there was no need to compete with them for Borneo Island. However, the British Empire did not think so. The gentlemen, nobles and capitalists in London would not dislike too many colonies. On the way to the governor's palace in Batavia, Wen Xian carefully observed the core city of the Dutch in the East Indies, which could also be said to be the ruling center. The Dutch Indonesian soldiers guarding the city were in low spirits, the sparse pedestrians on the streets were full of sorrow, and there were not enough goods for sale on the shelves of the shops, and some shops even closed directly. The Dutch have always valued business, and it is unimaginable that such a scene would appear in the core city of the Dutch colony. The entire city of Batavia made Wen Xian feel very depressed. You know, when the city of Pontianak was surrounded by 4,000 Dutch Indonesian troops, he could still drink tea and chat with Liang Zhao easily. After seeing the situation in the city of Batavia, Wen Xian already had the answer in his mind as to who would be the final winner in the Dutch-Indonesian war and gain control of the island of Borneo. "Sir Bonham, how are you?" Tevez came to the door of the governor's mansion to greet Bonham. "How are you, Sir Bonham?" Bonham squinted his eyes and said, "I heard that your recent situation is not very good. On my way to Batavia, I saw a lot of pirate ships," Tevez said expressionlessly. "Your Excellency came all the way from Hong Kong to Batavia. You didn't come all the way to see me laugh, did you?" "Of course not. This time I am visiting Batavia as a messenger." Bonham took out Liang Yao's letter and handed it to Tevez. Tevez opened the letter, read it hastily, put it away and said with a sneer, "Liang Zhao is so generous that he can let you be a messenger. If you are willing to negotiate, I am willing to act as a mediator to mediate." Faced with Tevez's sarcasm, Bonham didn't take it too seriously. The British are the kind of people who will not do anything without benefits. Letting the British come forward to mediate will cost a price. Of course, this is also one of the reasons why Tevez is unwilling to negotiate peace with Liang Zhao now. Another reason why Tevez was unwilling to negotiate peace was that he could not accept the peace terms offered by Liang Zhao. The Dutch Indies authorities would withdraw from West Borneo, pay a real compensation of $8 million, open the East Indies market and conduct free trade with Umbrella, negotiate tariffs by representatives of both parties, and set aside a piece of land of no less than 3 acres in the Batavia city area for Umbrella to set up an office in Batavia. Any of these peace terms would be enough to nail Tevez to the pillar of shame. Unless he was at the end of his rope and had no other choice, Tevez would not accept such harsh peace terms. "Please tell Liang Zhao that I will accompany you to the end," Tevez straightened his back and said with full energy. "Then I'm afraid you will lose even more." When Xian shook his head and said, "Excuse me, you not only don't understand Liang Zhao, but you also underestimate Liang Zhao." Since the main force of the Dutch-Indonesian authorities on Borneo Island was completely wiped out and the senior Dutch-Indonesian General Anderson was captured, the Dutch-Chinese War entered garbage time. During this period, apart from sporadic conflicts between the two sides at sea, the war on land came to a temporary end. After Elvis easily captured the undermanned Kendlangan, the Dutch-Indonesian army lurking in the South Borneo region was in a state of panic, and even dared not leave the stronghold. Considering the cost of ruling and the problem of manpower, Liang Zhao's focus at this stage has shifted to consolidating the existing occupied areas. Rather than using core armed forces to continue to expand the occupied areas, Liang Zhao only has the core forces of the Western Brigade. If the occupied areas continue to expand, he will also face the problem of shortage of core forces and inability to effectively control the new occupied areas. Moreover, too much dispersion of forces can easily leave opportunities for the Dutch-Indonesian authorities. However, although the main force of the Western Brigade no longer expands outward. However, after rearming and a short period of training, the resistance forces of the Chinese Resistance Company still advanced to South Borneo, exerting pressure on the Dutch-Indonesian remnants and the pro-Dutch Sultan Emirat in South Borneo. By mid-May 1854, armed merchant ships recruited from California arrived in Pontianak one after another. Along with these armed merchant ships, there was also a newly built Bold-class steamship and 3 Loach-class steamships. With the addition of these new forces, Liang Zhao's confidence increased, and he was not afraid of the East Indies fleet of the Dutch-Indonesian authorities at sea. Along with the armed merchant ships, there were also port workers and investors from California who arrived in Pontianak. These port workers were very experienced, and many of them had participated in the construction of Pearl Harbor, Port of Los Angeles, and Port of Jinshan. Now, these port workers will be responsible for the construction and operation of the Port of Pontianak. Since the establishment of California, California has always been the only state to introduce industrial workers from outside, and there is little precedent for exporting industrial workers. The last time Liang Zhao exported industrial workers was when he was building Pearl Harbor. This was 3 years ago. Investors in California also keenly realized that Liang Zhao wanted to focus on the development of Pontianak, otherwise he would not have spared no expense. Therefore, although the war has not yet ended, many investors came to Pontianak with a mentality of seeking wealth and fame and danger, ready to take a gamble. The successful experience of their peers told them that as long as they followed Liang Zhao's footsteps, even if they could not eat meat, they could at least drink a mouthful of soup. At this time, Pontianak was very lively, and public trials were held almost every day. As the public trials progressed, Liang Zhao's reputation among the Chinese in West Borneo also rose. The purpose of the public trial was mainly to settle accounts with those who committed numerous crimes against the Chinese during the Dutch-Chinese War. Some of these people were the management of the Lanfang Company, some were traders who resisted the company, some were local chiefdom natives who acted as accomplices of the Dutch-Indonesian authorities, and even senior Dutch officers in the Dutch-Indonesian army. During the public trial, the Chinese in the entire West Borneo region were excited. After the trial of 5 majors, 2 lieutenant colonels, and 1 colonel of the Dutch-Indonesian army, there was a voice for the public trial of Anderson. However, for practical reasons, Liang Zhao did not plan to publicly try Anderson. Anderson was one of the most senior generals in the Dutch Indian Army, and he also had the title of Viscount. As a bargaining chip, Anderson could play a much greater role than as a public trial object. These voices did not scare Anderson, who was desperate and eager to die, but scared the Sultan of Sanfa and the Sultan of Pontianak. According to this public trial law, they would be the next to be publicly tried and hanged. Sultan Akhamuddin of Sanfa and Sultan Al-Qadri of Pontianak came to Liang Zhao in tears, constantly admitting their mistakes and expressing their loyalty, which made Liang Zhao feel amused. Liang Zhao told them with a smirk that if they wanted to show their loyalty, they should send troops to assist the Umbrella Company mercenary group to attack the Sultanate of Brunei and the Sintang Sultanate deep in the inland area. Liang Zhao was just joking with them, but he didn't expect that these two fools would really set off with the broken guns they had just seized from the Dutch Indian Army after returning. But Liang Zhao did not stop them. It would be good for the Sanfa Sultanate and the Pontianak Sultanate to deal with the other neighboring Sultanate chiefdoms. At this time, the chiefdoms that are not pro-China and have no vision should also be spanked to let them know the pain. Chapter 417 ending. These days, 57,000 Chinese have been naturalized in Pontianak alone. If we include Dongwonlu, Luai and other places, the number of Chinese who are eligible for naturalization should be more than 200,000. As for how many Chinese there are in West Borneo, it is a mess. Even Liu Shambang, Wang Jia, Ye Tenghu and others don't know. Deng Wenkang, who officially took over the political affairs of West Borneo, reported to Liang Zhao on the population situation in West Borneo. After 5 years of war, the Chinese population on West Borneo has dropped sharply. Some have died, and some have returned to their hometowns. However, according to Deng Wenkang's rough estimate, there are still more than 200,000 Chinese who choose to stay in West Borneo. The registration books provided by various companies cannot be trusted. Everything should be done in person. If you are short of manpower, you can ask me. But the registration must be done well, and it must be done by us. Do you understand? Liang Zhao said as he flipped through the brand new registration books provided by Deng Wenkang. 200,000 Chinese people are not a small number. As long as they are well managed, it is not a fantasy to establish a relatively stable rule in the West Borneo region or even the entire Borneo Island. You know, in the entire East Indies under the rule of the Dutch Indies, not to mention the Dutch, even the European settled population has not reached this number. If there were 200,000 Europeans in the East Indies, the Dutch Indies authorities would not have to hire native soldiers who are 2 or 3 times the number of white people to form the Dutch Indies Army. Pontianak, California? You can think of this household registration address. Fremont glanced at the registration book in Liang Zhao's hand and said with a smile, the two places are tens of thousands of miles apart. According to the standard of the United States that a population of 60,000 can apply for statehood, 200,000 people is already a lot in Fremont's opinion. Even if only the adult male Chinese citizens in Borneo are counted, the number must exceed 60,000. As long as we become naturalized, we will have a legitimate reason to protect West Borneo next time. Moreover, these naturalized people can also provide tax revenue, Liang Zhao said. Whether based on the reality of the United States or the current international situation, it is obviously unrealistic to immediately incorporate Borneo into the administrative divisions of California for direct rule. However, Liang Zhao can still temporarily colonize Borneo Island, just like the Dutch East India Company did. And this is also the best solution for administrative management of the Borneo region at present. However, Liang Zhao is not satisfied with only treating West Borneo as a colony, but has the ambition to make West Borneo a core region. By the way, third brother, Liu's father-in-law and son-in-law have some news. According to more reliable news, Yu Tingfen is now hiding in Batavia, seeking the protection of the Dutch East India authorities, Deng Wenkang said to Liang Zhao. Liu Shaoxin, the former general manager of the Lanfang Company, and his son-in-law Yi Tingfen are the primary targets of public trial. If these two chief criminals are not tried, Liang Zhao's public trial movement will be meaningless. The whereabouts of these two people are also a matter of concern to Liang Zhao recently. Is there any news about Liu Shaoxin's whereabouts? Liang Zhao asked. There's only news about Yi Tingfen at the moment, but no news about Liu Shaoxin. Deng Wenkang shook his head and said. Keep asking, Liang Zhao explained. Compared with the Chinese in Borneo who are more concerned about the public trial, the investors from California, whether Chinese or white, are more indifferent to the public trial, and can be said to be rational. although Liang Zhao sent troops to Borneo in the name of protecting overseas Chinese. But anyone in California who has a little independent thinking ability knows that Liang Zhao sent troops to Borneo for the oil in Borneo and the potential for rubber planting. These investors took US dollars to ask for land and houses in Pontianak, lined up in front of the prisoner of war camp, and bought indigenous prisoners of war to prepare for a big fight and open up rubber plantations. Some smart businessmen have even bought rubber seedlings and tree species in South America in advance, transported them to the market in Pontianak for sale, and made a lot of money first. Of course, there are also a small number of investors who think that the investment cycle of rubber plantations is too long. It takes 6 to 8 years for a rubber tree to be bred and tapped. 6 to 8 years is too long for them. Compared with the rubber business, these investors are more concerned about the news of North Borneo oil. Bonham went to Batavia as a mediator to mediate but did not achieve any results. This result was also expected by Liang Zhao, and Liang Zhao was not surprised by it. Since Tevez is unwilling to talk, he will fight until Tevez is willing to talk. As some of the ships damaged in the Battle of Java were repaired and armed merchant ships hired from California were recruited to fight, Liang Zhao has more and more chips in his hands. He now has the ability to fight another naval battle with the East Indies fleet of the Dutch Indochina. However, it was not Liang Zhao's side that first launched a counterattack from the sea, but Cruzan led the East Indies fleet. Facing the offensive of the East Indies fleet, Liang Zhao did not intend to take the initiative to fight, but withdrew the ships into the Kapuas River. The estuary of the Kapuas River has built relatively complete coastal fortifications and artillery batteries. It would be a pity if these coastal fortifications and artillery batteries were not used. Furthermore, although Liang Zhao's naval forces had been supplemented to a certain extent, he did not have an overwhelming advantage in the face of the East Indies fleet, which had also completed its assembly. Liang Zhao decided to use the coastal defense artillery to consume a wave of the East Indies fleet first, and then let Sven lead the fleet to engage in a naval battle with the East Indies fleet. Soon, 41 large and small ships of the East Indies fleet flying the tricolor flag appeared at the mouth of the Kapuas River. Cruzan's mood was very complicated when he returned to this sea area. 4 months ago, he had just experienced the biggest defeat in his military career here. Now that he was back here, he was not sure of avenging his previous shame. The new warships of the Umbrella Fleet left a deep impression on Cruzan. Until now, Cruzan clearly remembered the appearance of the new steam battleship. On the way from Batavia to Pontianak, Cruzan sailed very smoothly. In addition to encountering some pirates along the way, he did not encounter the main fleet of the Umbrella Company. The Umbrella Company's fleet disappeared suddenly like a ghost. The calmer it was, the more uneasy Cruzan felt. On the coast at the mouth of the Kapuas River, Cruzan looked far away. Due to the clear sky, he soon saw the artillery fort standing at the mouth of the Kapuas River. In just 4 months, the opponent had built a relatively complete coastal defense artillery fort at the mouth of the Kapuas River, indicating that Liang Zhao's involvement in the Dutch-Chinese War on the island of Borneo was not a whim, but a premeditated one. The artillery forts at the mouth of the river were built very professionally. The firepower network formed by these artillery forts completely blocked the mouth of the Kapuas River. Cruzan smiled bitterly. It seems that there are professional engineers in Liang Zhao's army. This battle will be difficult to fight. Cruzan's guess was not wrong. The artillery forts and coastal defense fortifications at the mouth of the Kapuas River were designed by Fremont, and the commander of the Arizona Infantry Regiment, Kruger, was responsible for supervising the construction. Before retiring, Fremont was an officer in the U.S. Army who was famous for surveying and fortification design. Engineers were Fremont's old profession. Even when Liang Zhao established the engineering company, he specifically consulted Fremont. Many of the officers in the Western Brigade's Engineer Battalion have received instruction from Fremont. Chapter 418, Decisive Battle. To be honest, Cruzan didn't want to engage in a firefight with the coastal defense batteries. In the last naval battle, Cruzan had already experienced the power of the Sacramento gun. Under normal circumstances, any naval commander with a normal mind would not allow his fleet to engage in a firefight with the enemy's coastal defense batteries. When the technological level is similar, the caliber of the coastal defense batteries fixed on the batteries is often larger than that of naval guns, and the shooting accuracy is also higher than that of naval guns. There is basically no advantage in firing at each other between naval guns and coastal defense batteries, at least in the mid-19th century. However, Cruzen is now tasked with destroying the port of Pontianak, paralyzing local maritime traffic, annihilating the enemy fleet, and regaining control of the sea. In order to complete the task assigned to him by Tevez, the security battery at the mouth of the Kapuas River is a hurdle that Cruzen cannot bypass. The commander of the Western Brigade responsible for the defense of the estuary is Kruger, the head of the Arizona Infantry Regiment. Kruger calculated the distance from the ships of the East Indies Fleet to the coastal defense batteries. Although the East Indies Fleet had entered the firing range of the coastal defense batteries at this time, Kruger was not in a hurry to open fire. According to the intelligence collected and the confessions of the Dutch and Indian prisoners of war, Cruzen was a cautious man. If he opened fire too early, Cruzen would soon give up shelling the coastal artillery in order to reduce losses. By then, it would be difficult for Krug to achieve any results. Krug ordered the soldiers responsible for operating the coastal artillery to hide in the bunkers temporarily until he gave the order to fire and then bombard the East Indies fleet. Cruzen first sent 3 sailing warships to bombard the coastal artillery at the mouth of the Kapuas River. Accompanied by a burst of artillery roars, black spherical projectiles hit the coastal artillery like raindrops. The artillery under fire still did not respond. This greatly increased the confidence of the 3 sailing warships that were conducting fire reconnaissance. In order to improve the accuracy of the artillery, the 3 sailing warships approached the artillery and continued to output continuous firepower to the coastal artillery at the mouth of the Kapuas River. Under the bombardment of the 3 sailing warships of the East Indies Fleet, 1 artillery was soon destroyed. The soldiers in front reported the news to Kruger. Kruger remained motionless and still did not express anything. Since he wanted to lure the East Indies Fleet to bombard his coastal artillery at close range, it was inevitable to release some bait. California has a developed military industry, and guns and cannons can be rebuilt if they are damaged. These weapons are not the most scarce things for the Western Brigade. After a round of bombardment, Kruger finally ordered the soldiers on 1/3 of the coastal artillery batteries to symbolically fight back. After seeing that the coastal artillery batteries finally started to fight back, the old fox Kruger dispelled his doubts and asked the main ships to step forward to participate in the bombardment. But Kruger still kept a hand and left 12 ships as a reserve on standby to deal with emergencies that might occur at any time. Cunning Kruger. Seeing that he paid the price of the destruction of 3 artillery batteries, Kruger still did not attack with all his troops, and Kruger could not help cursing. When the main force of the East India Fleet came within 700 to 800 meters of the coastal defense batteries, all the batteries at the mouth of the Kapuas River finally opened fire. The vengeful shells rained down on the densely packed East India Fleet. Compared with the naval guns of the East India Fleet, the types of shells on these coastal defense batteries were much richer. In addition to the conventional solid shells, there were also expensive explosive shells. Explosive shells were expensive, but the killing effect on personnel was far beyond the reach of conventional solid shells. As long as the explosive shells hit the decks of the ships of the East India Fleet, a large number of crew members would surely fall. Although Cruzen was mentally prepared, the powerful firepower from the coastal defense batteries at the mouth of the Kapuas River still caught Cruzen off guard. Cruzen reacted quickly. Seeing that this was a trap set by the other party, he hurriedly ordered to stop firing at the other party's coastal defense batteries, and all ships turned around and drove out of the range of the other party's coastal defense batteries as quickly as possible. It has to be said that compared to the Royal Dutch East India Army, the East Indies Fleet is indeed a well-trained force. In this case, it was still able to maintain a relatively orderly order and quickly sailed out of the range of the coastal defense batteries. We still lack enough excellent artillery. Kruger watched the Dutch East India Fleet escape from the range of the ship's guns and couldn't help but sigh. In the short bombardment, although the coastal defense batteries at the mouth of the Kapuas River caused certain losses to the East Indies Fleet, the losses of the East Indies Fleet were not fatal. Only 2 unlucky armed merchant ships of the East Indies Fleet were sunk, and 3 sailing warships suffered moderate or above injuries. The rest of the ships were basically slightly damaged or even did not suffer any losses. Such a result is far from Kruger's psychological expectations. The direction of the next war depends on how the fleet led by Sven performs. As soon as the bombardment ended, the Umbrella Fleet led by 2 Daring-class steam warships rushed out of the high Kapuas River with great momentum and rushed directly to the East Indies Fleet that had just withdrawn. 3 months later, more than 70 ships from both sides fought again in the sea area. Compared with the first confrontation, The East Indies fleet's combat power declined due to the loss of a large number of elite crew members, but it was still a very difficult opponent. Although all the ships of the Umbrella fleet were equipped with new Sacramento guns, the performance of the naval guns was one generation ahead of the opponent, but this battle was still very difficult. The advantage at the weapon level only made up for the shortcomings of the Umbrella Company in terms of crew. In Kruger's view, the Umbrella fleet was only slightly superior in the entire naval battle. It did not have the crushing advantage over the Dutch Indonesian army that the Western Brigade had on land. However, as a Prussian, Krusen did not know much about naval battles. After all, Prussia was not a maritime power. Seeing that the other side was entangled with the East Indies fleet at all costs, Krusen realized that the other side wanted to completely destroy the East Indies fleet. The existence of the East Indies fleet was a huge deterrent to the other side. As long as this fleet existed, even if it was hiding in the port as an existing fleet, the other side could not gain control of the sea with peace of mind. After 2 hours of fighting, both sides handed in a mutually damaged answer sheet. The results and losses suffered by both sides can be said to be on par. However, as the casualties of the East Indies fleet increased, the East Indies fleet gradually fell into disadvantage. The advantages of the Umbrella fleet in terms of weapons technology also gradually emerged. The new naval guns equipped on the ships of the Umbrella Company fleet have an extremely fast firing rate, and their killing efficiency on personnel and ships is much higher than their traditional front-loading smoothbore naval guns. Seeing that the situation was unfavorable, Krusen decisively issued an order to retreat and save the ship. The seriously injured ships bravely took on the task of covering the rear, buying time for the ships in good condition to retreat. Sven also saw Krusen's intention. He ignored the broken ships that were entangled with them, and went straight to chase the main force of the East Indies fleet that fled south in panic. At this time, the south wind was blowing on the sea, which made the East Indies fleet, which was basically made up of sailing ships, want to cry without tears. Even God was against them. The steam of the Umbrella Company fleet was very high. These steamships easily caught up with the ships of the East Indies fleet that wanted to escape back to Batavia and pursued them relentlessly. After a whole day of fighting, the naval battle that was not completed 3 months ago finally ended in the same sea area. After losing more than half of the warships, that is, at the cost of 17 ships, Liang Zhao's Umbrella fleet finally won the victory with difficulty, basically achieving the goal of completely annihilating the East Indies fleet and completely gaining control of the Java Sea. The huge East Indies fleet, in the end, only 5 ships fled north and disappeared. Even Krusen himself became Sven's prisoner. At this point, the last card in the hands of the Dutch Indonesian authorities was also torn to pieces by Liang Zhao. Peace became the only option for the Dutch Indonesian authorities. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 419, Bombardment of Batavia. After this defeat, the Dutch Indonesian authorities no longer had the possibility to compete with Liang Zhao for the control of the Java Sea. The Umbrella fleet, flying the Umbrella flag and the Stars and Stripes, was no longer satisfied with just cruising in the waters near Batavia. These ships even sailed to the sea less than 1 nautical mile away from the port of Batavia, and approached the port of Batavia from time to launch artillery fire. The Dutch Indonesian officers guarding the port could even clearly see the faces of the other crew members with a telescope. The entire city of Batavia was forced to enter a state of war readiness. Previously, no one in the Dutch Indonesian authorities would have thought that Batavia, as their base camp in the East Indies archipelago, the rear of the rear, would become the front line one day. The Chinese army was going to land in Batavia, attack Batavia, and confiscate the property of the Dutch in Batavia, just like the property of the Dutch expatriates in Pontianak. This news spread like wildfire in the city of Batavia. This made the Dutch expatriates in Batavia even more panicked. Previously, in order to exaggerate Liang Zhao's cruelty, the Dutch Indonesian authorities made a big fuss about Liang Zhao's cruel act of hanging prisoners of war in Pontianak, which had a very good effect in Batavia. Unfortunately, this was not the effect that the Dutch Indonesian authorities headed by Tevez wanted. Tevez and others hoped to make the Dutch expatriates in Batavia united and join the army to fight against Liang Zhao by exaggerating Liang Zhao's cruelty. Obviously, Tevez overestimated the martial virtue of the expatriates in Batavia. The Dutch expatriates in Batavia believed in Liang Zhao's cruelty, but the more they believed in the rumors of Liang Zhao's cruelty, the less they dared to join the Dutch Indonesian army and Liang Zhao's Western Brigade to fight. The Dutch expatriates in Batavia were not boors with abundant martial virtues in South Africa. Compared with joining the army and going to the battlefield, they cared more about their gains and losses in the business field. Since the Dutch Indonesian authorities lost their control of the sea, the Dutch expatriates in Batavia began to suffer losses, and their losses were still expanding. The Dutch expatriates in Batavia had reached their limit of patience with Tevez. Many well-connected Dutch expatriates have written to Amsterdam to put pressure on the incompetent governor of Batavia, Tevez, to be replaced. Since the East Indies fleet was almost annihilated, Tevez has been living in fear almost every day. The sound of shelling on the seashore also reached the governor's mansion from time to time, which made Tevez even more upset. To be honest, the bombardment of Batavia by the Umbrella Company fleet did not cause substantial damage to the city of Batavia. The effect of the shelling was more on the psychological level. The shelling was gradually destroying the confidence of the Dutch expatriates in the city and disintegrating the morale of the Dutch Indonesian army. As for the Javanese living in Batavia, they did not feel much and were the most careless group in Batavia. It made no difference to them whether the Dutch or the Chinese were in charge of Batavia. The frustration of the citizens of Batavia and the low morale of the Dutch Indian army made Tevez realize that it was no longer realistic to continue the Dutch-Chinese war and gain more favorable bargaining chips for the Dutch Indian authorities. He should now seriously consider the issue of peace talks. As the victorious party, Liang Zhao, who was still in Pontianak at this time, could not be happy. Once the cannon sounded, gold was worth a lot of money. In order to obtain the overseas territory of Borneo Island, he also paid a great price. In less than half a year of war, he had consumed only $4.8 million in military expenses. If the lost ships were counted, the loss would be even greater. Even so, this was still the expenditure under the condition of a favorable war. Before the war, Liang Zhao prepared a gold reserve of $10 million to deal with this war. Now the remaining gold reserves are estimated to support Liang Zhao's Western Brigade in the East Indies for about 9 months of medium-intensity operations. We have gained control of the sea, and now we can take Batavia in one go. Elvis looked very confident. As a relatively pure soldier, he obviously didn't care much about politics and economy. I just told Tevez to attack Batavia, but you took it seriously. Liang Zhao rolled his eyes at Elvis. By taking over half of Borneo, Liang Zhao's strategic goal for this expedition has been achieved. He has little interest in the South Borneo region, which has a high cost of ruling, let alone Batavia, which has been run by the Dutch for more than 200 years. Liang Zhao currently has no foundation in Batavia, and taking Batavia is just an additional burden. Liang Zhao's intervention in the Dutch-Chinese war on Borneo, and the lack of strong reactions from Britain, France and other countries, does not mean that they will not react to if he further extends his hand to the wealthy Java island. The British do not want the Dutch to dominate Southeast Asia, and they do not want Liang Zhao, an American Chinese, to dominate Southeast Asia. Moreover, the Netherlands has not directly intervened in the Dutch-Chinese war for half a year, and a lot of the reasons are that Liang Zhao intervened in the Dutch-Chinese war, and the main battlefield is still on Borneo. Liang Zhao has not yet touched the core interests of the Dutch. If he really gets his hands on Batavia or Java Island, the Dutch will definitely fight him to the death. At that time, he will not only face the Dutch Indochina colonial government, but also the pressure from the entire Netherlands and even other European powers. Liang Zhao's attitude towards Batavia is also very simple. He can pretend to fight, or even launch a tentative attack to put pressure on the Dutch Indochina, but he can't really take it down. Liang Zhao is more concerned about how much war deposit he can get from the Dutch Indochina to make up for the military expenditure in the past 6 months. Kruger sent a telegram that the governor of Batavia, Tevez, has arrived at the mouth of the Kapuas River and wants to meet with you, Fremont said, holding the telegram he just got from the telegraph room. In the past 6 months, in addition to fighting, Liang Zhao has not been idle. The entire West Borneo region has initially built a telegraph network with Pontianak as the center. Liang Zhao was able to receive news from Dongwonlu, Luai, Montreux, the Kapuas River estuary position, and even the Kendang area that had just been occupied in Pontianak. Tevez came to Pontianak in person, which means they are more willing to negotiate now. Liang Zhao smiled. Send a telegram to Kruger to send the governor of Batavia to Pontianak. Tevez did not contact Liang Zhao through letters or envoys, but chose to come to Pontianak in person, which means that Tevez is now seriously considering the peace talks. This is a good signal. The next thing Liang Zhao has to consider is how to grab the biggest fruits of victory for himself at the negotiation table. After fighting for half a year, it was all for this negotiation. Chapter 420 War criminals are not prisoners of war. Kruger, who was stationed at the mouth of the Kapuas River, personally took Tevez on a small steamer to Pontianak after receiving the telegram. Although it was still wartime, Umbrella had actually gained control of the sea after 2 naval battles. Therefore, compared with Batavia, where supplies were scarce and all industries were depressed, Pontianak, where production, life and even trade were not significantly affected, seemed more vibrant. Merchant ships that were checked and obtained permission traveled on the Kapuas River to the port of Pontianak. Investors from South China and California, USA, flooded in. This largest city in West Borneo was even more lively than before the war. What impressed Tevez the most was Liang Zhao's strong military strength. Before, Tevez could only understand Liang Zhao's military strength through war reports from the front line, but in West Borneo, he could directly contact the opponent's soldiers and officers of all colors. It was these people who defeated the Dutch-Indonesian army that he was proud of. To be fair, the armed forces controlled by Liang Zhao are also quite complex. In addition to the relatively pure personnel composition of the California Infantry Regiment, the personnel composition of the Arizona Infantry Regiment and the Oregon Infantry Regiment in the Western Brigade is not an exaggeration to say that they are a racial museum. The officers and soldiers of these infantry regiments are not only Americans, Chinese, English, Scottish, French, Germans, Dutch, but also Indians and Japanese. As for the Umbrella Company's mercenary group, the composition is even more complicated. Tevez really couldn't figure out how Liang Zhao led an army with such a complex composition. The composition of the Chinese armed forces in West Borneo is relatively simple, but since Liang Zhao intervened in the Dutch-Indian War, these Chinese armed forces are no longer the main force fighting against the Dutch-Indian army, but have become auxiliary roles. Colonel Kruger, I'm curious, how do you command a group of subordinates of different ethnicities? Tevez couldn't help asking on the way to Pontianak. Different ethnicities? Your Excellency the Governor, you misunderstood, my subordinates are all Americans. Kruger smiled faintly. Although the officers and soldiers of his Oregon Infantry Regiment looked very different, they were all American nationals, or more precisely, Californian officers and soldiers. All officers and soldiers, including Kruger himself, recognized their Californian identity. This was fundamentally different from the Dutch-Indonesian army, which had no basic citizenship and whose officers had a variety of nationalities. The morale of the freemen who fought for their own interests and the slaves who fought for the interests of the slave owners was naturally different. Moreover, Kruger's soldiers were equipped with the most advanced light weapons in the world today, and they had generous and timely military pay. In Kruger's opinion, it was reasonable for them to have such a loss ratio with the Dutch-Indonesian army. However, Kruger was too lazy to explain this to Tevez. After arriving in Pontianak, Tevez saw the gallows standing in the square when he passed by the square, and several Dutch-Indonesian officers and soldiers were being executed. The execution of Dutch-Indonesian officers and soldiers in broad daylight and in full view of the public, and the Dutch-Indonesian officers and soldiers of Dutch and European descent, made Tevez very angry. After meeting Liang Zhao, Tevez questioned Liang Zhao harshly. Your Excellency has written to us several times asking us to spend money to redeem the prisoners of war. We have also clearly expressed our intention to spend money to redeem the prisoners of war. Why did you still torture and kill the prisoners of war of our Royal Netherlands and the Dutch-Indonesian army? I now doubt your sincerity in peace talks. Liang Zhao frowned and said, those who were sent to the gallows were not prisoners of war. They were war criminals who committed numerous crimes against civilians. They were war criminals identified by the local people and your Dutch-Indonesian army. As for my sincerity in peace talks, if you think I am not sincere enough, please go back to Batavia and we will continue to fight until you think we are sincere. Tevez was speechless. If there is a standard for committing war crimes against civilians, I am afraid that few officers and soldiers of the Dutch-Indonesian army are clean. As for continuing this war, this is even more impossible. In the current war situation, unless the Dutch government personally intervenes, They cannot win this war with the ability of their Dutch-Indonesian colonial government alone. But the Dutch government's personal involvement will involve another problem, that is, whether the American government behind Liang Zhao will personally intervene. Tevez dare not bet on this point. Once the bet is lost, it will not be a matter of losing Borneo Island, but a matter of losing Sumatra Island and Java Island. As for pinning hopes on the mediation of Britain and France to force Liang Zhao to make concessions, Tevez has not considered this issue. It's just that Britain and France are now busy with the war in the Near East and have sent a large number of troops to the Black Sea region. It's hard to say whether they will be willing to help the Netherlands. With the combat effectiveness shown by Liang Zhao's armed forces in the Borneo region, it is not enough to send a regiment of advanced troops to solve the problem. Even if Britain and France want to intervene, they have to weigh the cost of intervening in this war. Moreover, Liang Zhao's relationship with Britain and France is not good, but it is not bad either. He also knows some people in the British and French military and political circles. It is probably difficult for Britain and France to reach a consensus on whether to intervene in the East Indies issue in a short period of time. After all, curbing the westward expansion of Tsarist Russia is now the top priority for Britain and France. Compared with Tsarist Russia, the troubles of the Netherlands and the United States in the East Indies seem to be less important. Besides, it is easier to invite a god than to send him away. Liang Zhao is not an easy character to deal with, and Britain and France are not easy to deal with. Tevez sat down at the negotiation table with humiliation. He wanted to hear Liang Zhao's conditions for peace talks. At present, stopping the loss in time is the only option for the Dutch-Indonesian authorities. The Dutch-Indonesian troops will all withdraw from Borneo Island. Batavia will compensate us for military expenses of $8 million, and the Dutch-Indonesian prisoners of war will be allowed to be redeemed at our preferential price. All trade exchanges after the war will remain the same. In addition, we need to have a piece of land of no less than 3 acres in the Batavia city to set up an office of umbrella company, so that we can communicate and dialogue in the future. In this land, our station staff are not bound by your laws. These are all the conditions for my peace talks, Liang Zhao said after sitting down. In Tevez's opinion, Liang Zhao's conditions were more acceptable to him, except that all trade exchanges would continue as usual. The rest of the conditions were very harsh and difficult for him to accept. The whole island of Borneo, including South Borneo, Tevez asked carefully. West Borneo was definitely not going to be taken back. When he set out from Batavia, Tevez was ready to give up West Borneo. As for giving up the whole island of Borneo, this was not within Tevez's psychological expectations, nor was it within the psychological expectations of the Dutch-Indonesian authorities. Why? Isn't South Borneo part of the island of Borneo? Liang Zhao asked back. You have a really big appetite. The whole island of Borneo. Can you eat it and digest it? Tevez sneered. I don't need your excellency to worry about whether my appetite is good or not, Liang Zhao said. As long as West Borneo, that was the old calendar before. Now that Liang Zhao has won both sea and land fronts, he has more and more chips in his hands, so of course he is qualified to ask for more. Although considering the cost of ruling, Liang Zhao only wants to directly rule and manage the West Borneo region where Chinese live and the oil-producing areas in North Borneo for the time being. East Borneo and South Borneo are not within the scope of direct rule and management. But if there is a chance to drive the Dutch out of Borneo, Liang Zhao will naturally not let it go. After all, if the Dutch are driven away, he will have one less powerful competitor in Borneo, and he can slowly infiltrate South Borneo and East Borneo in the future, and then effectively manage these enemies. $8 million in military compensation is too much, we can't afford it. In addition to the full withdrawal of the Dutch-Indonesian authorities from Borneo, the $8 million in military compensation also made Tevez feel unacceptable. Tevez read the documents provided by Liang Zhao. Liang Zhao had no intention of releasing the Dutch-Indonesian prisoners for free after the war. That is to say, except for those Dutch-Indonesian soldiers who were identified as war criminals and executed and the crew members who voluntarily employed by Liang Zhao, the remaining prisoners of war, the Dutch-Indonesian authorities still had to pay Liang Zhao to redeem them. The ransom Liang Zhao offered for an ordinary prisoner of war was $300 per European soldier, and the officer's asking price would be much higher. Roughly speaking, it would cost about $500,000 to redeem these prisoners of war. As for the local indigenous soldiers, mainly Javanese, Liang Zhao had already solved this problem for Tevez. Tevez only needed to consider redeeming more than 1,000 European soldiers of the Dutch Indian Army. As for the indigenous soldiers, both sides kept silent about it. Liang Zhao needed plantation slaves to cultivate rubber plantations, and Tevez was also happy to save money and trouble. After all, if Liang Zhao asked him to redeem the indigenous soldiers in the Dutch Indian Army, he, as the governor, would not be able to explain to the vast number of indigenous soldiers in the Dutch Indian Army if he did not redeem them. Now, Liang Zhao directly kept silent about these indigenous captives. Even if the indigenous soldiers in the Dutch Indian Army had emotions in their hearts, they could not vent them on him. Tevez could also give an explanation to the Dutch Indian Army. It's not that we don't redeem people, but those damn Americans don't let them go. You know, not counting the compensation for the dead and the wounded, our expenses in the past 8 months have reached $10 million. Setting the compensation at $8 million is the greatest goodwill we can show to you. Liang Zhao's attitude was very firm. Liang Zhao did exaggerate the military expenditure of $10 million. In fact, Liang Zhao's expenditure this time was just over $6 million. Even if Tevez was stubborn and did not intend to sign the agreement, Liang Zhao had more than $3 million left of the $10 million prepared for this war. Even if he did not raise military funds from California, he could easily fight the Dutch and Indonesian authorities for half a year. After gaining control of the sea and the battle situation was settled, the subsequent military expenditure would be much less. Chapter 421 Old Friend. Tevez stared at the treaties with a sad face, and his hand holding the treaties began to tremble uncontrollably. The accompanying Dutch officials were like eggplants hit by frost, listless. They had completely lost their arrogant demeanor in the past. One thing is certain, due to the poor performance in this Dutch-Chinese war, many Dutch officials present will lose their positions soon, including Tevez. The treaty is too harsh, please give us some time to consider. The arrogant Dutch governor lowered his posture and said to Liang Zhao in a pleading tone, if your army performs well enough on the battlefield, the contract will definitely not be so harsh. Liang Zhao stood up from his chair, he seemed a little impatient. I will only give you 3 days to consider. 3 days, this is the deadline Liang Zhao gave Tevez. Liang Zhao had just walked out of the door when Sven walked up to him and said, Sir, an old friend is visiting. Old friend? Liang Zhao was a little confused. He really couldn't remember who had come to visit him in Borneo Island, a remote place, at this moment. It's General Tromelin of the French Navy, Sven said with a smile. Liang Zhao stroked his forehead and said, Ah, it's him. What is he doing here? Tromelin was the commander of the French Navy's Pacific Fleet. Liang Zhao's first warship, the Roland, was bought from Tromelin. The Cheoa on Yangwai was also bought from a French shipyard by Tromelin. Of course, Tromelin, as a middleman, also made a lot of money from Liang Zhao when buying the ships. Liang Zhao's impression of this French naval general can't be said to be very good, nor can it be said to be bad. Although Tromelin made a difference of more than $30,000 from him, at least he was paid for his work. Liang Zhao finally successfully purchased an advanced steam warship from the French. The French side also fulfilled its promise and helped him train qualified crew members. As far as the 2 naval battles in the Java Sea are concerned, the 3 warships purchased from the French were a relatively successful military purchase. These 3 warships have played their due value, and Liang Zhao has not been a sucker. No, Sven shook his head and said. He only said he wanted to see you, but didn't mention what the specific matter was. I heard that General Tromelin had previously visited San Francisco, and when he learned that you were not in San Francisco, he made a special trip to Borneo, which must be a very urgent matter. The French came at the right time. Tromelin came to Borneo in a hurry to find him, most likely because of the Crimean War. Only this matter was worth the French general coming to him. Although Britain and France have directly intervened in the Crimean War. But the importance of this war to both sides is different. To put it bluntly, the powerful British Empire can afford to lose, but France, or more precisely, Napoleon III, cannot afford to lose. If the British lost, they would only lose part of their interests in the Near East, but if France lost, given that the old revolutionary base had a glorious tradition of sending emperors to the guillotine, Napoleon III would eventually face not only the question of whether he could keep the crown of the Second French Empire on his head, but also the question of whether he could keep his own head. The French nobles and the people could push Napoleon III to the throne of emperor, and naturally they could also pull him down. The French were not at all soft-hearted when it came to changing emperors. Therefore, compared with Britain, France was more eager to cut off the bare claws of Tsarist Russia, extending to the Black Sea region and the Balkans and win this war. Only in this way could France break through the shackles of the Vienna Conference, sweep away the dull atmosphere in the country after the fall of the First French Empire, and boost national self-confidence and France's position in the international community. Of course, Napoleon III needed a victory of this war to consolidate his throne and demonstrate his legitimacy. The French people did not love a republic or a monarchy, they loved power. As long as France is strong enough, whether it chooses a republic or a monarchy, turns left or right, their people are happy to accept and support it. Meet this old friend. Liang Zhao adjusted his collar while thinking about how to use France to put pressure on the Dutch-Indonesian authorities to get Tevez to sign the contract as soon as possible and to contain the British in Sarawak. I think we can make some concessions so that Tevez can sign the contract earlier. Fremont is shorter than Liang Zhao, and his legs are not as long as Liang Zhao. In order to keep up with Liang Zhao, he had to speed up. Fremont doesn't like the humid and hot environment in the tropics, but it's not because he is weak. As an explorer, Fremont is very strong. Compared with the humid and hot tropics, Fremont is more adapted to cold weather. Most importantly, California is about to hold a gubernatorial election, and Fremont is eager to return to California to participate in the election as soon as possible. Although California has reached a consensus on Fremont's second term as governor, the election is just a formality. But Fremont still hopes to return to California and give a speech in front of the people of California to narrow the distance between himself and the people of California. Only when the people of California are closer to him, his future governance will be smoother. Fremont has a special feeling for California, and he does not want to be a mediocre governor. They have no choice, and I will not make any concessions. Liang Zhao's attitude is still as firm as ever, and he also sees Fremont's mind. If you want to return to California earlier, I can prepare a clipper for you. It's not bad to have these 3 days. Fremont muttered his concerns. What if Tevez still doesn't sign after 3 days? Continue to waste time with him. He will sign, Liang Zhao said very confidently. Sir, long time no see. As soon as he saw Liang Zhao, Tromelin shook Liang Zhao's hand enthusiastically as if he had seen a long-lost brother. Unlike the first meeting, Tromelin prepared a valuable gift for Liang Zhao this time. It seems that Tromelin took the initiative to visit this time because he really had something to ask of him. These gifts were probably not given to him by Tromelin himself, but by Napoleon III. Tromelin was a stingy person. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Liang Zhao invited Tromelin to have a cup of tea. After the tea, Tromelin praised Liang Zhao again, expressing his shock that Liang Zhao became a general at such a young age, and at the same time praising Liang Zhao's performance in the military conflict in the East Indies. Liang Zhao dealt with Tromelin in a perfunctory manner. He had heard these words so many times that his ears were calloused. Finally, Tromelin said that he wanted to visit Liang Zhao's military camp. Chapter 422 Friends of the French People. Has there been no outbreak of cholera or other diseases in your barracks? Tromelin asked. The barracks of the Western Brigade are so clean that they don't look like barracks. Compared with the Western Brigade's neat and tidy barracks, the French barracks can be described as pigsty. What's even worse is the French barracks on the front line, which are not even as good as pigsty, such as the French barracks in the Crimea Peninsula. Do you want cholera to break out in my barracks? Liang Zhao asked with a smile. The Western Brigade has strict requirements for housekeeping, so the hygiene of the officers and soldiers of the Western Brigade is much better than that of other armies. Of course, sufficient supply of materials is also an important reason why the Western Brigade can ensure basic hygiene. They have enough building materials to build barracks, enough blankets and military uniforms for washing, and enough soap for cleaning. In tropical areas, not paying attention to cleanliness is a very fatal thing. This is the concept that Liang Zhao instilled in all officers and soldiers before the expedition, so everyone in the Western Brigade attaches great importance to housekeeping. As for cholera, Liang Zhao had already had successful experience in preventing and controlling cholera 4 or 5 years ago. As long as soldiers were provided with clean drinking water and food, cholera could be prevented from spreading in the barracks. These requirements seem very simple, but it is not easy to do. For example, providing clean drinking water and food to frontline soldiers during wartime was difficult for even the British and French armies at that time, not to mention the armies of other countries. The coalition's barracks on the Crimean Peninsula had a very serious cholera outbreak. Our army almost lost its combat effectiveness in an organized manner, regiment by regiment. This large-scale non-combat casualties is very fatal to us. You know, the cost of deploying troops to the Near East is much higher than that of Tsarist Russia, Tromerin said worriedly. Many soldiers of the coalition did not die on the battlefield, but died of cholera and related epidemics. In the mid-19th century, when cholera was rampant, the number of people who died from cholera was far greater than the number of people who died directly in the war. In the Crimean War, according to statistics from both Britain and France, the number of people who died from cholera was higher than the number of people who died in battle. The coalition army camp is seriously suffering from cholera, and the Russian army is probably not much better than the coalition army, Liang Zhao said with a smile. I am very optimistic about the coalition army's war prospects. I believe that the Frenchmen can avenge the shame of the expedition to Russia and win this war, but those grey animals of the Tsar are cheaper than our soldiers. They have millions of grey animals, Tromerin emphasized. Your Majesty pities his soldiers. I hope to reduce the casualties of the soldiers as much as possible. Napoleon I did not pity the lives of French soldiers, but his own political future. This was the biggest war gamble France had made since the Congress of Vienna, and the military field was not Napoleon II's forte. Napoleon III did not know how many casualties the current French army could bear, nor did he know how much war weariness the casualties on the front line would bring to the mainland. He hoped to minimize the casualties of the French army on the Crimean front so that the French army could maintain high morale and finally win the war. According to the intelligence I have seen, the coalition army is currently progressing smoothly, Liang Zhao said. It was going well, but we paid a heavy price. Tromerin got to the point. I heard that you have experience in successfully preventing and treating cholera. There are many experts in California who prevent cholera. If you are willing to help, that would be great. Of course, we are also willing to pay a generous reward for the medical services provided by California. California is the first place in the world to successfully prevent and treat cholera, and most of California's high-quality medical resources have been integrated by Liang Zhao in large cities led by San Francisco. This made Tromerin see the possibility of California providing medical assistance to the coalition forces. Do you think I look like someone who is short of money? Liang Zhao smiled. Then do you want it? Tromerin asked a little nervously. I heard that your Pacific Fleet has added several new ships in the past 2 years, Liang Zhao said casually. Do you want warships? If you want warships, you can place an order with our shipyard. They welcome big customers like you, Tromerin said with great embarrassment, spreading his hands. 4 years ago, the Roland was sold to Liang Zhao because it was damaged, so Tromerin did a favor and sold it to Liang Zhao. Of course, the most important reason was that the price Liang Zhao offered was too tempting, and Tromerin really couldn't find a reason to refuse. California today is no longer the California of 4 years ago. Tromerin had just been to California not long ago. California now has a fairly developed shipbuilding industry, which can not only manufacture civilian ships, but also advanced steam warships. Liang Zhao has no need to buy warships from him. Tromerin couldn't figure out what Liang Zhao was up to. Could it be that Liang Zhao wanted to use his warship for free? Thinking of this, Tromerin couldn't help but become alert. The last time he sold the Roland, he had already caused controversy in the Navy Department. If he sold Liang Zhao's active warships this time, he might not be able to explain to the Navy Department. What I need is an active warship for emergency use. If you are willing to help me with this, I guarantee that your trip will be worthwhile and you will be able to give a good explanation to His Majesty Napoleon III, Liang Zhao said with a smile. The shipyard in California is capable of producing world-leading steam warships, but the production capacity is limited, and Liang Zhao is not yet able to produce warships like dumplings. In this expedition to Borneo, Liang Zhao suffered very limited losses on land, and more losses were at sea. Liang Zhao needs ready-made warships to consolidate the results that have been achieved, so that the Dutch authorities and other powers who are interested in Borneo will give up this idea. Of course, Liang Zhao also wants to deepen his understanding of French warships. In the 19th century, an era when shipbuilding technology was changing with each passing day, the French still had many unique shipbuilding experiences, and there were many things that Liang Zhao could learn. This Tromerin was obviously shaken, but he was still in hesitation and could not make up his mind. Liang Zhao turned to Deng Wenkang and said, Wenkang, get the map, soon. Deng Wencan brought the map of Borneo Island. Liang Zhao drew a small circle in the Sarawak region on the map, and said to Tromelin with his hands behind his back and a smile, "Sir, although your fleet is the Pacific Fleet, France lacks a potential good port in the Pacific region." Tromelin was excited when he heard this. He stared at Liang Zhao in surprise, and then approached the map, holding a magnifying glass to carefully examine the small circle Liang Zhao drew in the Sarawak region. Although this small coastal circle is small, it is enough to make Tromelin, and even the whole of France, excited. The first stop of France's colonization of Southeast Asia was Cambodia, and the signing of the Franco-Cambodian Treaty was in 1864. As for France's colonization of Vietnam, it was after the Sino-French War. Now France has not yet colonized Southeast Asia, and Vietnam is still one of the important vassal states of the Qing dynasty. France has not yet obtained a colony in Southeast Asia that can gain a foothold. Unlike the British Empire, which has colonies all over the world, France is the second largest colonial power. But the difference between the two is not as simple as a ranking. What colonies did the British occupy? South Africa, Egypt, India, Australia, Canada, and even Hong Kong in the Far East, where the degree of colonization is relatively low. These places are either densely populated and relatively developed economically, or rich in mineral resources, and can be a big blood bag for blood transfusion for the British mainland. What land did France occupy? North Africa, West Africa, Syria, Madagascar, French Guiana, and several small islands in the Pacific Ocean. The quality of these colonies is obviously not comparable to that of the British colonies. As far as Liang Zhao knows, although Tromelin's Pacific Fleet has several small naval ports on the small islands in the Pacific, these small naval ports are at best supply points for the French Pacific Fleet. If the ship encounters a little problem, it must be towed to Guyana for repair. Take the Roland 4 or 5 years ago. If the French Navy had a certain maintenance capacity in the naval ports on the small islands in the Pacific, Tromelin would not have to sell the Roland to Liang Zhao. When they invaded Hawaii, their ultimate goal was to obtain a good military port, but unfortunately the British ruined the plan. Tromelin couldn't help swallowing his saliva. He looked at Liang Zhao in disbelief. "Are you serious? When did I ever joke with you?" Liang Zhao asked back. Fremont, who was standing by, couldn't help but bow to apologize to Tromelin, who had a fiery look in his eyes. He then pulled Liang Zhao aside and said to Liang Zhao in a low voice, "Borneo Island was obtained by our soldiers with their blood. France has made no contribution to this matter. Now you are actually going to give them a piece of land." Liang Zhao was going to give a piece of land in Sarawak to the French, which made Fremont a little unbalanced. Fremont objected to this. "I'm being generous to others," Liang Zhao said with a smile. "The border between us and the British in Sarawak is still a vague concept. If we do this, I'm afraid we will be angry with the British," Fremont said with some concern. "The British are not the Dutch, and they are not so easy to offend. That's better than being angry with the British and the French at the same time," Liang Zhao sighed and said. "Even Tsarist Russia can't stand the British and French alliance, let alone us. Besides, the war in the Near East will end one day. If the British want to compete with us for the North Borneo region, or even the entire Borneo Island, what should we do then? Have you thought about it? Do you want to use the French to contain the British?" Fremont still frowned. The problem Liang Zhao is worried about is also the problem he's most worried about. With the ambition of the British, they will definitely not be willing to occupy only a corner of Sarawak. After the Dutch forces were driven out of Borneo Island, the forces on the island will only be them and the British. It's not a matter of containment. I just don't want the British and the French to be in the same boat on the issue of Borneo. Liang Zhao patted Fremont's arm and said to Fremont in a comforting tone, "Don't worry, I'm a businessman and I won't do business at a loss. We just lent this land to the French temporarily, and we will take it back sooner or later." "Take it back? How to take it back?" Fremont shook his head helplessly. "That depends on how California and the United States develop in the future," Liang Zhao said seriously. "Although California has achieved some results in the development of the past few years, their strength is still too weak compared to these old colonial powers. These colonial countries are like a gang, and Britain and France are the leaders of this gang. Whether Liang Zhao can occupy Borneo for a long time still depends on the faces of these two leaders. You decide. No matter what decision you make, I support you. I believe that the choice you make is the most beneficial to us." Fremont finally gave Liang Zhao enough trust and no longer opposed the decision made by Liang Zhao. Liang Zhao nodded, and he walked back to Tromerin and said to him, "I'm sorry, sir. Mr. Fremont and I have some disagreements on this matter. You take back your decision." Tromerin regretted it. Liang Zhao shrugged helplessly. He paced back and forth for a long time, as if he was in a dilemma. Finally, in Tromerin's disappointed and expectant eyes, he walked up to Tromerin, gritted his teeth, and said to Tromerin very firmly, "General, you know that as an American, I have always attached great importance to friendship with France. Although I have differences with Lord Fremont, I have the final say in this matter. No one can affect our rock-solid friendship. As long as you are willing to provide us with 3 active warships of more than 1,000 tons, put pressure on the Dutch, and let the Dutch sign the contract as soon as possible. The land within this circle belongs to you in France." Fremont was stunned by Liang Zhao's self-directed and self-acted performance. It was a great loss to the American drama world that this kid didn't go to speak. "Your Excellency is really a good friend of our French people." Tromerin shook Liang Zhao's hand with tears of gratitude. He glanced at the rank of Major General on his shoulder and was very excited. If they could reach this agreement, Tromerin would have exceeded the task assigned to him by Napoleon III, and he could add another star to his rank. Of course, Tromerin knew that this matter was far from being as simple as it seemed. Liang Zhao would not give him a piece of land for no reason. But only cheese was tempting enough. Even if the hungry mouse knew that it was the cheese on the mousetrap, the hungry mouse would pounce on this delicious cheese without hesitation. The French Pacific Fleet was the hungry mouse. They were really eager to get a good port in the Pacific region. "Of course, we are friends." Liang Zhao picked up 2 glasses of wine, handed one to Tromerin, and kept one for himself. He raised a glass and clinked it with Tromerin, his old friend. "May the friendship between America and France always last and be indestructible. Cheers, also for the friendship between me and your Excellency." "Cheers." Tromerin showed a bright smile like a chrysanthemum, and then drank the wine in the glass. After drinking this glass of friendship wine, Tromerin immediately put down the glass, rubbed his hands excitedly, and said impatiently, "Sir, then let's sign the contract now." Chapter 423 Agent. The British were ambiguous, and they said that they were mediating the dispute between the United States and the Netherlands in the East Indies from an absolutely neutral and objective standpoint. The French simply stood on Liang Zhao's side, urging Tevez to sign the contract immediately and restore peace to the East Indies. The attitudes of Britain and France made the Dutch and Indocin authorities headed by Tevez feel desperate, a powerless despair. At this time, they were in a heavy and bitter mood. Britain and France are allies now, and they are allies in wartime. Although Tevez saw that the British were somewhat dissatisfied with Tromerin's firm stance on Liang Zhao's side. But Tevez could not use the British dissatisfaction to gain benefits for the Dutch and Indocin authorities. Since Tromerin made a clear statement on behalf of France, even if the British representative, the governor of Hong Kong, Bonham, was dissatisfied with the French statement, he could not stand on the opposite side of the ally and put the conflict between the two sides on the surface. At present, the British and French coalition forces are fighting side by side in the Crimean Peninsula and the Balkans. At this time, words that are not conducive to unity cannot be said, and things that are not conducive to unity cannot be done. The greatest support that Bonham could give to Tevez, that is, the Dutch Indies colonial authorities, was to neither support nor oppose the French, and to maintain an absolutely neutral position. Tevez also knew that it was meaningless to continue to delay. The next day, Tevez led the delegation back to the negotiating table. Tevez raised his trembling right hand and signed his name on the Treaty of Pontianak in disappointment. He was the first governor of Batavia to sign such a humiliating treaty. He also knew that once he signed his name, he would be endlessly scorned and abused after returning home. But he had no choice. The signing of the Treaty of Pontianak meant that the Dutch Indies colonial authorities ultimately failed to complete the last important puzzle of the East Indies, Borneo Island. It also meant that the Dutch colonial expansion in the East Indies was forced to end. The next issue that the Dutch Indies colonial authorities had to consider was not how to continue to expand their territory, but how to defend the existing colonies. However, these were issues that the next governor of Batavia had to worry about, and had nothing to do with Tevez. Thinking of this, Tevez felt a little relieved. Leaving this damned tropical smoky land with a bad name and returning to Europe for retirement does not seem to be a particularly bad choice. After the signing of the treaty, Trommerin was very happy to hand over the 3 active warships of the French Pacific Fleet and the crew responsible for training to Liang Zhao after receiving the new land in Sarawak. After getting these 3 new ships, Liang Zhao felt much more relieved. At least he didn't have to worry about someone messing around during the window period of repair of his damaged warships. In addition, Liang Zhao also agreed to send a medical team to the Crimean Peninsula Theater and the Balkan Theater to provide medical services to the French army and assist the French army in defeating cholera. In return, Trommerin also agreed to Liang Zhao's request to send a military inspection team to the Near East for observation and study. Trommerin also knew that even if he did not agree with Liang Zhao's sending of a military inspection team, Liang Zhao would find ways to send his military inspection team to the Near East. For example, disguising military personnel as medical personnel. No one can stop Liang Zhao from doing what he wants. Instead of hiding it, it is better to sell a favor to Liang Zhao directly. If you agree to Liang Zhao's request openly, you can also get a favor. What's more, the diplomatic relations between the United States and France are relatively friendly, and there is no sharp conflict of interest between the two sides. The signing and entry into force of the Pontianak Treaty made the Chinese in Southeast Asia feel extremely excited. These stateless people who drifted in a foreign country, who were not loved by their grandmothers and uncles, finally saw a ray of light in the darkness. When occupying Pontianak earlier, Umbrella Company had already begun to publicize that as long as the Chinese in Southeast Asia joined the American nationality, Umbrella Company could provide them with personal safety protection. However, the situation was still unclear at the time. Although many Chinese in Southeast Asia heard the news, but they were worried that once Liang Zhao finally lost to the Dutch Indonesian colonial authorities, those who joined the American nationality would inevitably be retaliated by the Dutch Indonesian colonial authorities. Therefore, they were very cautious about naturalization and kept a wait-and-see attitude. Only the Chinese who originally lived in Pontianak were more active in naturalization. But now the dust has settled, and the Dutch were defeated in this competition for Borneo Island. The Chinese in Southeast Asia also recognized the strength of Liang Zhao and his subordinate Umbrella Company from this war, and they no longer had any worries. More and more Chinese in Southeast Asia began to gather in Borneo, especially in West Borneo. These Chinese not only have young and strong laborers who go out to sea to work hard to survive, but also wealthy merchants. The arrival of these people has rapidly increased the population of large settlements such as Pontianak, East Wanlu, and Kendaungan, and also filled the gap after the withdrawal of Dutch merchants. The Borneo region, which has restored peace, shows a scene of vitality and everything competing. After finishing the finishing work, Liang Zhao officially handed over the power of the Borneo region to Deng Wenkang, and then took the returning fleet to Xiangshan. Liang Zhao finally returned to Xiangshan. Liang Shaoqiang had already returned to Xiangshan from Yangzhou on a small steamer with a sentry company of personal soldiers. Even Deng Yan drove Xiangshan from Nagasaki. When Liang Zhao's fleet arrived at Xiangshan, the two had already been waiting for Liang Zhao at the Xiangshan dock. "Is your second uncle comfortable being the emperor in Japan?" Liang Zhao teased Deng Yan as soon as he got off the boat. "No matter how comfortable being the emperor is, it's not as comfortable as having your own home," Deng Yan said as he looked at the land under his feet. Compared to being the emperor feared by everyone in Japan, Deng Yan still prefers his hometown and his family in California. "Are there any interesting stories in Japan recently?" Liang Zhao asked. "Not really interesting stories," Deng Yan said with a worried look on his face. After Japan was forced to open its country, some knowledgeable people in Japan advocated to follow the story of the Taiko reform and learn from the Tang dynasty, to carry out reforms, and to learn from the United States and Western countries to save themselves. Some feudal domains have purchased foreign guns and cannons from Western countries, and imitated Westerners to establish a new army to protect themselves. The Japanese have taken action not only in the army, but also in the navy. The steamship named Sombing that you captured was purchased by the Satsuma domain from the Dutch, but they didn't expect to be intercepted by you in the middle of the journey. I'm not interested in small things. This small steamship was not intercepted by me, but by the Dutch. It's not my fault. The Japanese are ambitious and we must be on guard." Liang Zhao agreed with this. As a country that was also closed to the outside world and was also knocked on the door by the powerful countries with strong ships and powerful guns, Japan's response was indeed much faster than that of the Qing dynasty. "Should we put pressure on the Japanese shogunate authorities and discuss with Britain, France and other countries not to sell weapons and ships to the Japanese pirates. Deng Yan hopes to control the influx of Western weapons to curb the training of new-style armies by various Japanese feudal domains. At present, there is only half a regiment of U.S. troops stationed in Nagasaki for a long time. Although the troops of this half regiment are all professional soldiers from the Western Brigade, their professional quality and combat effectiveness are guaranteed. But the number is too small. Deng Yan is worried that once the feudal domains of the Japanese archipelago have trained enough new-style armies, they will become restless. Once trouble arises at that time, it may be difficult for the half regiment of U.S. troops stationed in Japan to deal with it. Arms are a big business. If we don't sell them, and don't let others sell them, and cut off their money, and still want them to be of one mind with you, is there such a beautiful thing in the world? Liang Zhao shook his head and smiled. Banning the influx of foreign guns and cannons into Japan is not feasible, either in theory or in practice. Cutting off people's money is like killing their parents. If you don't sell them yourself, and don't let other powers such as Britain and France sell them, they will be angry with you. Previously, many feudal lords had requested to purchase guns and even warships from California. However, although California has its own relatively complete military industry, its production capacity is not very sufficient. After meeting its own needs, Liang Zhao allocated excess production according to the priority of customers. Among them, the order priority of Yuan is the highest, followed by Britain and France, and finally the arms orders of Japan and other countries. Liang Zhao is now very reluctant to deal with the orders of the French, not to mention Japan, which has a lower priority. Therefore, the arms that Japan can obtain from Liang Zhao are very limited. However, as the dust settles on the war in Borneo, this situation will soon be improved. With less consumption, Liang Zhao can also allocate some arms. Then increase the number of U.S. troops stationed in Japan. The Japanese's self-improvement made Deng Yan feel more and more insecure. At the beginning, they were able to defeat 100,000 shogunate troops with only 2 or 3 regiments of troops, largely because of their technical advantages in weapons and equipment. Once this technical advantage is reduced, Deng Yan has no idea whether the half regiment of U.S. troops stationed in Japan can deter the various feudal lords in the Japanese archipelago and the shogunate authorities. You pay for the military expenses. Liang Zhao rolled his eyes at Deng Yan. I think you have been the Japanese emperor for the past 2 years in vain. You have been in Japan for so long, but you don't even understand the national conditions of Japan? At present, there are hundreds of feudal lords in Japan, and it is difficult for them to be of one mind. What I am afraid of is a unified Japan, not a fragmented Japan. The cost of overseas garrisons is very high, and the federal government has approved very limited military expenditures for the U.S. military stationed in Japan. Increasing the number of U.S. troops stationed in Japan, and the final military expenses will also be borne by Liang Zhao. If increasing the number of U.S. troops stationed in Japan can solve the problem, Liang Zhao is willing to spend some money to solve the problem. But the problem is that spending money may not necessarily solve the problem. Although Japan's territory is not vast, it is not a small country. What's more, Japan's current population is more than 30 times that of California. It is unrealistic to rely on the number of garrisons to maintain its interests in Japan. Supporting agents is the most cost-effective method. Do you mean to support the feudal lords who are close to us and serve as our horses and dogs? Maintaining Japan's current fragmented state. Deng Yan reacted quickly. That's right. A divided and weak Japan is a good Japan. When the British devils attacked Guangdong, did you hate the British devils more, or did you hate the traitors who led the British devils more? Liang Zhao asked. Of course, those dog traitors, Deng Yan blurted out. This is a good idea. As long as the pro-American Japanese vassal is supported, these Japanese vassal can share a lot of pressure for them. The most important thing is that this method saves money. As for whether a civil war will break out in Japan, Deng Yan believes that Liang Zhao has the same idea as him, and he hopes that a civil war will break out in Japan. I don't support waste. If you want to be my dog, this vassal must be a strong vassal and must obey me absolutely. Is there such a vassal? As he said, Liang Zhao got on the carriage and asked Deng Yan if he had a suitable agent. After Deng Yan sat down, he thought for a while and stroked his forehead and said, Really, who? Liang Zhao asked curiously. Hizen Saga Domain, Naomisan Abemochi, do you still remember this person? Deng Yan replied. How can I not remember? When we first arrived in Japan, The first person we beat was him, Liang Zhao smiled. Deng Yan continued, before the founding of Japan, Saga domain was one of the most powerful domains. After the founding of the country, due to the signing of the Treaty of Nagasaki with us, Saga domain's situation became very bad. Unlike other domains, Saga domain not only had to share the indemnity in the Treaty of Amity between the United States and Japan, but also had to pay a separate indemnity of 1 million taels in the Treaty of Nagasaki, and bear the huge cost of studying in the United States for students. Saga domain had repeatedly requested that the 1 million taels of silver indemnity in the Treaty of Nagasaki be incorporated into the Treaty of Amity between the United States and Japan, and that all the domains in the world bear this indemnity together. However, it was rejected by the lords of the other domains. Naomi's and Abeshima then developed hatred for these domains. What's more valuable is that Saga domain is the most respectful domain to us, and it is a domain that can be cultivated. Our base is in Nagasaki, and it's hard for him not to be respectful to us, Liang Zhao said. Saga domain, this old unlucky domain, is really a bit miserable. When Liang Zhao led his army to Japan, the Saga clan was the worst hit and enjoyed the one-on-one VIP service of the U.S. military. After Liang Zhao returned to California, the U.S. military stationed in Japan was set in Nagasaki, and the Saga clan had to be careful to deal with these uncles stationed in Nagasaki from then on. Strange, I have heard a little about the Japanese. According to common sense, this Japanese pirate lord should hate you too. You two are the culprits who forced the Japanese to open up. Liang Zhao, who had not interrupted, couldn't help but sighed. He didn't understand the Japanese's brain circuit a little bit. The more they were bullied, the more submissive they were? Could it be that these Japanese had a problem with their brains? Brother Liang, you don't know that the Japanese are afraid of the strong and are the most bullying. The more you bully him, the more submissive he will be to you. To put it bluntly, he is a cheap bone, Deng Yan explained Liang Zhao's doubts. The 2 years in Japan have deepened his understanding of the Japanese. Even so, on the way back, I will meet Naomi Kojima and make a conclusion after a survey. Liang Zhao touched the stubble on his chin. Although the strength of his saga was weakened after the founding of the country, it still has the foundation of a strong clan. As long as Naomi Kojima is not a helpless person, it is not impossible to let Saga clan stand proudly at the top of the clans with a little support. More importantly, the current situation of his Saga clan is different from other clans. The rest of the clans only need to pay a total of 11 million taels of silver in compensation from the United States. The compensation for the Nagasaki article that his Saga clan needs to bear alone is as high as 1 million taels of silver. At present, his Saga clan has only paid 200,000 taels of this compensation, and the remaining 800,000 taels are still owed and are planned to be repaid in installments. Not to mention the principal, the interest alone is enough to make his Saga clan breathless. In short, this compensation is just a bit sad for Japan in other clans, but it is not impossible to pass it with a gritted teeth. The Hizen Saga domain was facing a real desperate situation. Moreover, the Hizen Saga domain was very close to Nagasaki. If there was any disloyalty, Deng Yan would be able to react quickly. I understand, Deng Yan nodded, and then as if he suddenly remembered something, he said to Liang Zhao, "There is an envoy from the Rakshasa kingdom who wants to see you. He is coming with my ship. Do you want to see him or not? Leave them alone for now." Liang Zhao gave his answer after thinking for a moment. Chapter 424, Retreat to Advance. The Liang family today is no longer the same as the Liang family of the past. Although Liang Zhao's grandfather did not return to Beijing to serve as an official, everyone with a discerning eye knew that the Liang family had a promising future. The court relied on two armies to suppress the Taiping rebels. One was the Hunan Braves and the other was the Yu Braves. The Liang family controlled half of the Yu Braves, or even more. If the Taiping rebels were to be pacified in the future, the Liang family would definitely be rewarded for their merits. Not only in Jiangshan, but even in Guangzhou, people were respectful when they mentioned this family. It was a routine for the governors and admirals of Guangdong and Guangxi to visit the Liang mansion during festivals. This time, when Liang Zhao returned from the Jiangbei camp in Yongzhou, the governors and admirals of Guangdong and Guangxi also made a special trip to greet him. "You kid, you've been hiding in that hellhole called Borneo for half a year and you're not willing to come back to see me." A person whose half-body is about to be buried in the ground. As soon as he saw Liang Zhao, Liang Weiming stepped forward and took Liang Yao's hand and complained. Although Liang Weiming's tone was filled with resentment, he still couldn't hide the relief and pride in his eyes. 4 or 5 years ago, Liang Weiming still thought that the Liang family had hit rock bottom and had almost no hope of a comeback. Liang Weiming no longer had much hope for the younger generation of the Liang family. Unexpectedly, the Liang family had such a figure as Liang Yao, who directly made the Liang family rebound from the bottom. It was really the blessing of the ancestors. Pa, don't talk nonsense, Grandpa, your health is strong, and our Liang family still needs you to support it, Liang Yao said. When my grandson was in Borneo, I often looked to the north, but I was busy with military affairs and couldn't leave. Walking into the mansion, Liang Yao glanced at the Yuyuang standing guard at the door. Although these Yuyuang were Liang Shaoqiang's personal soldiers, their clothes were very simple and plain, wearing a sturdy and clean cotton uniform, a headscarf wrapped around the head, and a belt full of bullets. Yuyuang's attire is a bit shabby. Liang Yao walked into the house with his hands behind his back. There was only a 4-corner octagonal table in the house for 4 people. There were 4 seats. Liang Weiming was supposed to discuss something with him. After Liang Weiming sat down in the chairman's seat, Liang Yao asked Liang Shaoqiang to sit in the vice-chairman's seat opposite the old man. Liang Shaoqiang was very tactful and gave this seat to Liang Yao. Although Liang Shaoqiang has made some achievements recently and is of a higher generation than Liang Yao, Liang Shaoqiang still cannot compare with Liang Yao in terms of contribution to the Liang family. Liang Shaoqiang was convinced and had no complaints about giving this seat to Liang Yao. Moreover, Liang Yao had clearly stated that he would develop in California in the future and had no intention of returning home. Liang Shaoqiang did not need to compete with Liang Yao for such a trivial matter. Yuyuang is not comparable to your Western Brigade. With a wealthy sponsor like you, how can I ask the court for money if I dress too well? Liang Shaoqiang said after sitting down. After everyone sat down, Liang Weiming signaled the servants to serve the dishes. In the Qing dynasty, who is not the financial backer of the Yuyuang, Liang Yao said with a smile. Although the military pay given by the Qing dynasty court is insignificant, the main source of military pay for the Yuyuang is not the court, but from the Cantonese merchants and gentry centered on the Guangzhou merchants. At present, the Yuyuang has 5 battalions with more than 5,000 soldiers. Unless an army of this size conducts high-intensity combat for a long time, it is not a problem for the Cantonese merchants and gentry to support a 5,000-man elite army with their financial resources. In the Qing dynasty, it is not like you in California. Liang Weiming picked up the chopsticks and took a bite of the dish and put it in his mouth. Many things cannot be solved with money. The performance of the Yuyuang is too good, which makes the court wary, and the court starts to suppress the Yuyuang, Liang Yao said. Liang Shaoqiang has not made any new moves in Yunzhou for more than half a year, and the number of arms purchased from him has also decreased recently. Most of the time, the rise of this Han armed force has made the Manchu nobles begin to fear it, and they are worried that the Yuyuang will become too powerful to be eliminated. It's also my fault that I was eager to make achievements and wanted to show off too much. I didn't listen to my father's teachings and my nephew's advice. You are right. The long-haired bandits must be suppressed, but they can't be suppressed too harshly. Liang Shaoqiang's face was full of regret. Since the court placed 2 uncles with yellow flags in our Yuyuang at the beginning of the year, the court has not used Yuyuang much, but only let Yuyuang guard the Jiangnan and Jiangbei camps to prevent the long-haired bandits from going north. When mentioning the 2 Manchu generals placed in the Yuyuang, Liang Shaoqiang did not hide his dissatisfaction with the 2 Manchu generals. After stabilizing the Jiangnan and Jiangbei camps and curbing the momentum of the Taiping army's northward advance, Liang Shaoqiang wanted to enter the Zhuangzi battlefield to fight. However, Liang Shaoqiang's request was quickly rejected, which made Liang Shaoqiang feel very disappointed. The Hunan army is also being watched by Tazabu, Liang Yao said. It was expected that the Qing government would place the 8 banners generals in the Guangdong army. The Qing government always had a guard against the Han armed forces. Tazabu was defeated in many battles and failed to take Jiujiang. I heard that he was so angry that he died. Of course, this is just a rumor. I don't know whether it is true or not. Maybe it was a psychological attack by the Taiping army. Liang Shaoqiang drank a small cup of rice wine and said with a smack of his lips. The Hunan army was beaten by the Taiping army in Zhuangzi. The Hunan army was in a mess in Zhuangzi. Even Zheng Yufan almost drowned himself. At this point, Liang Zhao showed a regretful expression, feeling extremely sorry for Zheng Yufan's failed suicide by drowning. Liang Zhao knew that Tezabu failed to capture Jiujiang several times in July, became depressed and died of illness. It was true, and it was not a psychological warfare of the Taiping army. However, the war is not favorable to the Hunan army at the moment, and morale is low. The news that important generals have died in battle, which is not conducive to morale, must be blocked as much as possible. From another perspective, the death of Tezabu may not be a bad thing for the Hunan army, but it may be a good thing. The Hunan army is not a weak force. There are still some heroes among the Taiping army to beat Zheng Yufan so badly, Liang Zhao said. There are indeed heroes among the Taiping army. The one who is responsible for the western expedition and fighting Zheng Yufan in Zhuangzi is Shi Dake, the pseudo-wing king of the Taiping army. At the beginning of the year, Shi Dake defeated the Hunan army twice in Hukou and Jiujiang. It is said that Shi Dake is now invincible in Zhuangzi and has captured many prefectures and counties. The only one who can beat the Hunan army so badly is the pseudo-wing king. Our Guangdong Yang has also suffered losses under him, Liang Zhao said. Although they are opponents, Liang Zhao still admires Shi Dake, a young general of the Taiping army. This time I asked Kainger to take sick leave and return home, which was also a retreat to advance. The Hunan army is not doing well in Zhuangzi. When the court has no soldiers to use, it still has to rely on our Guangdong warriors, Liang Weiming said. The Hunan army is mainly supported by Hunan gentry. Zheng Desheng had a smooth career. Before he took charge of the Hunan army, he had already been promoted to the position of left vice minister of the Ministry of Personnel. Although our Guangdong warriors also have the support of Guangdong gentry, the main food and salary is still raised by Guangdong merchants. Compared with merchants, the court is naturally more willing to trust gentry. Sure enough, the old ginger is still the shrewdest. Liang Zhao may be better than the old man in leading troops, but he is far less clear about the situation in the court than the old man. Grandpa is right. Compared with the generals of the Hunan army, the generals of our Guangdong army are not as righteous as those of the Hunan army. The court has a deep prejudice against factions. Although for the court, it is a disaster for either the Hunan army or the Guangdong army to become powerful, but between the two evils, the lesser of two evils is chosen. There are far more people in the court who support the Hunan army than those who support the Guangdong army, Liang Zhao nodded, agreeing with Liang Weiming's opinion. The main generals of the Hunan army, such as Zheng Yufan and his brothers, Luo Bingzhang, Zheng Zhangyun brothers, Hu Linai, Zuo Zongtang, Peng Yulin, etc., are either orthodox landlords or officials who have passed the imperial examinations. Although Liang Zhao, the general of the Guangdong army, is also from a landlord official family, Liang Zhao's own title of Juran and his almost zero political experience before he led the Guangdong army are obviously not good enough in front of the Hunan army bosses. If Liang Zhao defected to the Hunan army, he might not be able to enter the core circle of the Hunan army with his resume. As for another important general of the Guangdong brave, Pan Shichen of the Pan family, he was born into a business family in Guangzhou, although the Pan family tried hard to downplay their merchant origins. But without the efforts of 2 or 3 generations, it would be difficult for the Pan family to be truly accepted by the mainstream ruling class. To put it bluntly, if the court had no soldiers to use, and Pan Shichen had a good relationship in the capital, and Prince Gong supported the Guangdong brave, the Guangdong brave would not even have the opportunity to be established. Your nephew in California has a clearer understanding of the situation in the Qing dynasty than you do. Learn from him. Liang Weiming nodded to Liang Zhao with great approval, wondering why he didn't realize that there was such a rough gem in his family. Liang Zhao scratched the stubble on his head very embarrassedly, and said with a smile, "If I had half the ability of my third nephew, I would not have achieved nothing in my middle age." Third nephew, Uncle has one more thing to ask of you. We are all family. No matter what you ask, Uncle will just say it directly. As long as it is within my ability, I will do it for you, Liang Zhao said. Last year, the Hunan army was able to recover the thousands of miles of land in the Two Lakes and Zhuangzi. In addition to the insufficient garrison forces and shallow foundation of the Changmeo in these places, it was all due to the advantages of the navy. At present, the Hunan army is not doing well in Zhuangzi. It is only a matter of time for the court to reuse the Guangdong army. Once the court reuses the Guangdong army, The Guangdong army will have to enter Zhuangzi to fight. The water network in northern Zhuangzi is dense. If there is no satisfactory navy, we will be at a disadvantage in fighting against the Changmao, Liang Zhao said. Although the court has temporarily ignored the Guangdong army, Liang Zhao has already thought about the combat issues after the court reuses the Guangdong army. Liang Zhao's own ship is a small steamer. He knows that this kind of Western steamship is different from ordinary sailing ships. If you want the sailors to be proficient in using this kind of steam warship, you need a longer training period. At present, Guangdong Yuan has no war, and Liang Zhao wants to take advantage of this period to train a navy. Liang Zhao knows that Guangdong Yuan is a completely firearms army, which is very dependent on logistics and ammunition supplies. If there is a strong navy to cooperate in the battle and use the water network for supply and support, it will be twice the result with half the effort, greatly improving the chances of Guangdong Yuan's victory. Liang Zhao has a long-term vision, and his performance is slightly higher than Liang Yao's expectations of him. After thinking for a moment, Liang Zhao said, "There are no big ships, I don't have enough for myself, but I have as many loachboats as you want." At present, Liang Zhao's San Francisco shipyard has an annual output of warships of more than 1,000 tons, that is, the Daring-class steam cruisers, which is 2.5. This production capacity is not enough for him, so it is impossible to sell it to Guangdong Yuan. However, as the virgin product of the San Francisco shipyard, the loachboat has very mature production technology and sufficient production capacity, so Liang Zhao can still allocate some to Yu Yuan. Loachboats are enough. Liang Zhao was very satisfied with Liang Yao's answer. Loachboats are small boats for the knowledgeable Liang Zhao, but in the Qing dynasty, especially in the Yangtze River basin, they are definitely large ships. Moreover, loachboats are fast and flexible, and can move forward and backward freely without relying on wind power, which is very suitable for inland river operations. Fifth uncle. Don't blame me for not reminding you that the Navy is not like the land army. This thing is a gold-eating beast, Liang Zhao reminded. Liang Zhao wants to train the Navy, and Liang Zhao is very supportive. As long as Yu Yuan's Navy can be trained, it will be able to provide him with certain help in the Nanyang region in the future. I will coordinate with the Guangdong merchants on this matter, Liang Zhao said excitedly, rubbing his hands. That's good, but what do you plan to say to the court? Liang Zhao continued to ask. Haha, the court wants to invite me to fight this time. If they don't give me 3 or 5 battalions, I will stay in Xiangshan, Liang Zhao laughed. Kainger, watch your words. We are all family here. It's okay to be a little indulgent. If you say these things outside, won't it give people a handle? Liang Weiming said seriously, and then changed the subject. The official business is almost done, and it's time to talk about your private affairs. I still want to hold my great-grandchild as soon as possible. Private affairs? My nephew has an engagement. Liang Zhao's eyes lit up and said to Liang Zhao. You are 25 years old this year, and it's time to get married. Your grandfather knows nothing about the affairs of America. It happens that you are here today. Tell me today, what is the situation of Mr. Fan, and whether he is a good match for us? Liang Weiming asked very seriously. Liang Zhao knew that at his level, it was impossible to have a special pure love without exchanging interests. Being a good match is indeed very important to both parties. Mr. Fan is the richest man in America, and he is definitely a good match for my grandson, Liang Zhao said. Grandfather, please forgive me for being unfilial in agreeing to this marriage without asking you for your permission. It was a matter of urgency. America and the Qing dynasty are thousands of miles apart, and I am not a pedantic person. You have your reasons for agreeing to this marriage. Liang Weiming also expressed his understanding of Liang Zhao's behavior. Liang Zhao wrote to him as soon as he confirmed the marriage, which showed his respect for his grandfather. Do you have any photos? Liang Weiming asked. You also know photos? Liang Zhao was a little surprised. My grandson has lived in Western countries for a long time. I know some rare things of Westerners. What's so surprising? Liang Weiming smiled and stroked his beard, and then asked someone to bring a few silver plate photos. These photos include photos of the old man himself, family photos, and photos of Liang Weiming and local gentry and local officials. Liang Zhao looked at the photos. Liang Weiming in the photos faced the end calmly and confidently, and his demeanor revealed a bit of majesty. He didn't expect that the old man could still accept new things from the outside world so calmly at his age. Grandpa must have been handsome and talented when he was young. Liang Zhao looked at the photos and admired. Nonsense, when your grandfather was young, he was a famous handsome man in the whole village. When Grandpa passed the imperial examination, all the people who proposed marriage to our Liang family flattened the threshold. Liang Weiming couldn't help but straight to his chest. Stop talking nonsense. Did you bring back a photo of my granddaughter-in-law, Carnegie? Get a photo of Miss Elizabeth, Liang Zhao said to Carnegie. Carnegie opened the briefcase and took out 2 photo frames from the briefcase. There were silver plates embedded in the frames. One was a full-length photo of Elizabeth, and the other was a photo of the two of them at the Crystal Palace in New York. Liang Zhao had many photos of Elizabeth, but these 2 photos were the ones Liang Zhao was most satisfied with, so Liang Zhao only carried these 2 photos with him. After Carnegie put up the photo, Liang Zhao took out his pocket watch from his jacket pocket. He opened the pocket watch, revealing the portrait inside, and gently placed it on the table. Chapter 425 Thoughts? She's very pretty, but also a little weird. Liang Weiming held Elizabeth's photo for a long time, and finally made an image evaluation of the future granddaughter-in-law. Dad, you think any foreigner looks weird? Liang Xiaoqiang said. Liang Weiming put down the photo in his hand, and spoke with a hint of helplessness in his tone. As an elder, your marriage should be discussed with you. But I believe in your vision. You can make a name for yourself in America, so I won't make a mistake in choosing someone. Liang Weiming considered finding a suitable daughter-in-law for Liang Zhao in the Qin dynasty. But he could also see that Liang Zhao was not interested in the Qin dynasty, and it would be better for Liang Zhao to marry an American woman. This is the reason. Liang Weiming knew all these things, but he still felt a little uncomfortable when he thought that he, as the head of a family, couldn't even control a grandson. He didn't admit that he was too mediocre. After all, he was the only one in the Liang family who had served as an official in Beijing. It's just that Liang Zhao's performance is too good. Staring at Liang Weiming's complex expression, Liang Zhao knows what Liang Weiming is thinking. Some parents in the 21st century have a strong desire to control their children, not to mention Liang Weiming, a feudal patriarch in the 19th century. Although Liang Weiming said that he understood Liang Zhao's decision, Liang Zhao's behavior was ultimately a manifestation of disobedience in the eyes of this patriarch. However, Liang Zhao did not intend to be a so-called obedient child. After all, the wife he wanted was not a Qin dynasty vase carefully selected by Liang Weiming for him, but a lifelong partner who was able to share his pressure. Mr. Fan said that his daughter cannot marry unclearly, and he wants us to marry Elizabeth in a grand manner. The wedding will be held in New York, and Mr. Fan hopes that you will be able to attend our wedding. He said that only if you attend the wedding of Elizabeth and me, he will truly marry his daughter off. Liang Zhao gave Liang Weiming a step. He was not talking nonsense. Vanderbilt did require the elders of Liang Zhao's family with social status to attend their wedding. Vanderbilt's first few daughters were looking for a son-in-law, and since the last daughter didn't want a son-in-law, she married him off in a hurry, letting everyone in America know that their daughter not only married a rich man, but also a gentleman from a scholarly family. Old Europeans laughed at Americans for their lack of culture, and Americans didn't know whether it was okay or not, so they cared a lot about the so-called cultural aristocracy and the so-called elegance that money couldn't buy. Vanderbilt was no exception. It seems that Mr. Fan is also a well-educated and well-mannered person. Liang Weiming smiled when he heard this. Mr. Fan started from a humble background, and he is not well-educated and well-mannered, but he is a sensible peasant. Liang Zhao smiled. Although I am an old man, I will go to your marriage no matter what, Liang Weiming said. I just happened to read your Universal Chronicle and I am also very interested in Western countries. I will also travel to America to broaden my horizons. Grandpa, has my father quit smoking opium? My mother attended the wedding. If my father didn't go, it would be a bit embarrassing, Liang Zhao asked. Liang Weiming only called Liang Zhao and Liang Xiaoqiang for this conversation, which also means that they are the only two people in the Liang family who can be used. Although Liang Zhao already had the answer in his heart, he still asked with a last glimmer of hope. He quit several times, but opium is not something that can be quit just by saying it. He relapsed. Liang Weiming sighed. Where is he now? Liang Zhao continued to ask. In the study at the back. I will ask the servants to take you there later, Liang Weiming said. Led by a maid, Liang Zhao walked along the corridor, passed through two moon-shaped doors, and came to the study where his father Liang Xiaoqian was. Compared with the last time they met, Liang Xiaochun's complexion was slightly better. Although he still looked haggard and could be seen as an old smoker at a glance, a trace of blood could be seen on his face, and his eyes were no longer empty. When Liang Yao entered the study, Liang Xiaochun was flipping through the account book. "You're back." Seeing Liang Yao, Liang Xiaochun was very excited. He stood up and looked at Liang Yao, not knowing what to say. "Dad only called you to Andengyan to have dinner. I know you are discussing important matters, so I won't go over and make trouble for myself. Not only discussing important matters, but also discussing my marriage," Liang Yao said lightly. "Your marriage?" Liang Xiaochun showed joy. Then Liang Xiaochun hesitated to speak. He knew that Liang Yao hated opium smokers very much. Since Liang Yao was unwilling to call him father now, it meant that Liang Yao still didn't recognize him as an opium smoker father, let alone let him attend the wedding. But since Liang Yao didn't want to recognize him as his father, why did he come to talk to him about this? "Yes, my marriage," Liang Yao said. Liang Xiaochun's thoughts were in a mess. After reorganizing his words, he said, "You don't even want to call me dad now, so I won't go and embarrass you." Liang Yao pointed at the pipe on the table and asked, "Do you still smoke?" Liang Xiaochun glanced at the pipe on the table and said, "I smoke very little now." Liang Yao stared straight into Liang Xiaochun's eyes, and Liang Xiaochun's eyes told him that he was telling the truth. At least compared to smoking in front of his ancestors before, Liang Xiaochun's situation has improved. It's not hopeless. This thing only makes a difference between smoking and not smoking, not more or less. Liang Yao continued, "If you want me to call you dad, want to attend my wedding, and want your grandchildren to call you grandpa in the future, then quit it." Liang Xiaochun's eyes shone brightly when he heard this. He gritted his teeth, grabbed the pipe on the table and threw it out of the window. "Just wait, I'll make you call me dad." Liang Xiaochun bit his lip and said very firmly, "What did you say to Big Brother? You told him to throw away his pipes, which are his most precious things." Liang Yao just walked out of the study and ran into Liang Xiaochun at the door of the study. "I didn't say anything, but I gave him some hope," Liang Yao said. "Haha, maybe Big Brother can really quit smoking opium this time," Liang Xiaochun laughed. "It's not so easy to quit this stuff," Liang Yao sighed. "If it was easy to quit, I wouldn't have asked you to write this rule into the military regulations of the Guangdong Yuan. This is the first rule in the military regulations of the Guangdong Yuan. When the Guangdong Yuan was just established, it was also the one that most people violated," Liang Xiaochun said with his hands behind his back. "No less than 100 Guangdong Yuan died under this military rule." As expected, Liang Yao said, "There is a Rakshasa messenger who wants to see you. Are you going to see him or not?" Liang Xiaochun asked. "The Rakshasa people have something to ask of me. There is no rush to see them. Just keep leaving them alone and let them worry," Liang Yao replied. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.